Full house. I love you. Well, we are all guests, but all the same, let me welcome, given that I see a large number of foreign journalists. Welcome to our country in St. Petersburg on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg Forum, which kindly provides us with the opportunity to hold field briefings. It has already become a good tradition, and therefore, I would like to thank the organizers for their continued support. I talked about the forum in great detail at the last briefing. I'll tell you briefly now. You see everything for yourself. Interesting, stunning presentation expositions, informative, rich agenda, topical topic of discussion. The geography is more than impressive. The participation, the numbers, I probably won't repeat it either. You all know this, both by the number of people present and by the number of countries of the delegations. CIS, BRICS, show, OSEA, Africa, Middle East, Latin America. This is just the delegation, and the representation is colossal in individual terms. The business program consists of 150 events, and of course, we are in St. Petersburg, a special city. It has many symbolic comparison names. One of them, of course, is an open-air museum. The stages of development of not only our national history, but also the world history of culture, are immortalized here. And the city of inspiration for a huge number of poets, writers, artists, architects, composers, representatives of creative professions. This is not only creative, but also how many scientists who have gained worldwide fame, and how many achievements there have been of lasting universal significance, including for the popularization of humanistic ideals in the best sense of the word. And in the year of the 80th anniversary of the victory, I want to say separately about the feat of this city, which was then called Leningrad, which survived a military blockade during the Great Patriotic War, which is truly a genocide, which has now been proven. It lasted 872 days, claimed the lives of more than 1 million people. This figure is not final, because more and more new data appear due to the work of scientists. They are published, they are open, and in 1965 year, let me remind you, marriage and heroism, the city was awarded the title Hero City, and the defense of Leningrad has become an enduring symbol of perseverance, courage, and the victory of good over evil. The feat of the Leningrader will always remain in the memory of not only the citizens of our country, but also of the whole world. You know, I just want to say that literally at the junction with the briefing, of course, with a break at 17:00, we will have a session where Irina Bulina, a resident of besieged Leningrad, will be the guest of honor. And you have a unique opportunity not only to meet with her, but also to talk, including a reprinted book, a book of her memory. The memory of her family will be presented. These are her diaries, these are her notes, and it has been republished with the support of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and concerned sponsors. Therefore, come, chat, learn the history of this city and our country firsthand, and by word of mouth, and by tradition. Since this is a field briefing, I will tell you about the international and interregional relations of St. Petersburg and the Leningrad region. We note the consistent work of the leadership from St. Petersburg and the Leningrad region to build up diverse interregional foreign economic relations with friendly countries, taking into account the realities of the current geopolitical situation. According to the results of the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, St. Petersburg is expected to reach record volumes of agreements with investors. In order to further strengthen Russia's technological sovereignty, efforts are being made to increase the foreign trade turnover of St. Petersburg and the Leningrad region, stabilize the trade balance compared to the level of the 22nd-23rd years, and further diversify the structure of foreign trade. China remains the main trading partner, and trade with Kazakhstan is expanding. Against the background of strengthening economic cooperation between the CIS countries, The development of trade relations with Belarus has great potential. Cooperation with Iran and Turkey is developing. The listed countries account for 77.5% of trade turnover, while China's share in exports is 43.2%, imports 43.1%. Major deals are concluded with Myanmar, the Republic of Korea, Brazil, Germany, Egypt. Relations with Serbia have expanded in the fields of healthcare, education, manufacturing, high technology, tourism, and urban infrastructure. The volume of trade turnover of St. Petersburg in the 24th year, compared with the 23rd year, increased by 9%, amounted to $56.7 billion. The value of the main export volume increased by 8.6%, amounted to $29 billion. Imports continued to grow to $27 billion. This is an increase of about 9.5%. Cooperation in the Leningrad region with Azerbaijani, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and South Ossetian partners is being strengthened. It is planned to sign an agreement with the Republic of Abkhazia, the region of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Syria, and the South African Republic. The external trade turnover of the region in the 24th year slowed down to 5.10%, amounted to $10.7 billion, not interest, billions. The largest trading partners are China, Turkey, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Brazil, India, Vietnam. The total share of trade with these countries is 75.6%. The Leningrad region also occupies one of the leading positions in terms of the growth of trade turnover with Belarus. Joint projects are also being implemented in the fields of construction, production of agricultural and municipal equipment. In general, the Leningrad region and St. Petersburg are leaders in building up the contractual and legal framework for interregional cooperation. New agreements are being concluded with friendly, constructive countries towards Russia, and appropriate roadmaps for their implementation are being developed. And in addition, St. Petersburg and the Kaliningrad region continue to maintain close contacts with compatriots in the Baltic states who have faced persecution by Russophobic regimes. Because of their unwillingness to take an anti-Russian position, people do not want to give up everything that is dear to them, which is the essence of their philosophy and life. In fact, they suffer for it, and a special place in the working calendar of the Russian regions was, of course, occupied by events in the context of celebrating the 80th anniversary of the Great Victory, war memorial work. Delegations from Abkhazia, Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan arrived in St. Petersburg to participate in the festive events. Of course, the blockade fighters, veterans living abroad, who took part in the Victory Parade and the Immortal Regiment campaign in festive concerts and processions, made their contribution to preserving the sacred memory of the feat of generations of winners. Well, I think you've been following all of this too. We come to the schedule of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia. On June 23rd, Sergei Lavrov will take part in the 11th Annual Primakov Readings Scientific and Expert Forum. It is organized by the Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Let me remind you that this forum has been gathering influential politicians, economists, scientists, international experts, and public figures from different countries in Moscow every year for many years. This allows the food to occupy a special place among such events. Let me remind you that Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov predicted in the 90s that overpolarity would become a key trend in world development. At that time, he promoted this absolutely exact revolutionary concept as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, who was engaged from the 96th to the 98th year. The current state of affairs in the international arena has fully confirmed the political foresight and farsightedness of Yevgeny Maximovich. In his speech at the readings, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will assess current international events and talk about the priorities of our country's foreign policy. And, of course, there will be a discussion at which the minister will answer questions. On June 24th-25th, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Sergei Lavrov, will pay an official visit to Turkmenistan, make up for his sentences with the president of this country, deputy chairman of the Cabinet of Ministers, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkmenistan. The sides will discuss the upcoming political contacts at the highest level, the development of bilateral relations, including cooperation in trade, economic, cultural, and humanitarian spheres. There will be an exchange of views on the regional agenda agenda, the situation in the world, as well as the interaction of the two countries, within the framework of multilateral formats. And on the 24th-29th of June, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Lao People's Democratic Republic will pay an official visit to Russia. Negotiations and meetings will take place in Moscow, and a meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov is scheduled for June 26. The parties intend to discuss the state of prospects for the development of bilateral partnership in the Asia-Pacific region, with an emphasis on the implementation of the agreements that were reached following the results of the summit talks in Moscow on May 9th, Kazan on October 24th last year. The ways of promoting political dialogue, trade and economic cooperation in the field of defense and security, and humanitarian contacts will be examined in detail. Of course, they will be inventoried, and special attention will be paid to the issues of consolidation of coordination of actions in international and regional affairs. And now we turn to the current international agenda. Of course, the Iran-Israel escalation, unfortunately, continues, the most dangerous stage of escalation of tension in the Middle East. The reason for it was the unprovoked aggression against the sovereign unmember state of Iran, which was undertaken by Israel in violation of the Charter of the United Nations and the norms of international law. Of course, I am sure you are familiar with the statements of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which strongly condemn this criminal adventure, fraught with catastrophic consequences for regional and global security. Attempts to justify it with imaginary nonpartisan concerns are, of course, outright cynicism. Let me remind you, as of the 13th of June, these are just the proofs of the above-mentioned thesis. When the first strikes were carried out on the territory of Iran, there was an intensive, albeit difficult negotiation process, in the form of indirect Iranian-American contacts with the assistance of Oman. On the 15th of June, the next round of this substantive dialogue was scheduled, for which Tehran prepared a number of proposals designed to bring the desired outcome closer. The session of the EIA Board of Governors was also in full swing, where the issues of the Iranian nuclear deal were discussed. As a result, Israel's actions have undermined and set back the multilateral efforts initiated with considerable difficulty, aimed at reducing confrontation, finding reliable solutions that eliminate unfounded suspicions and prejudices against the Iranian peaceful atom. Isn't this what they were trying to achieve in West Jerusalem, making a conscious choice in favor of escalating tensions and disrupting peace efforts? A lot of people are asking themselves this question now. It is also striking, of course, the hypocrisy of the leaders of individual Western European countries, diligently inflating the anti-Iranian hysteria. In the Magatai Board of Governors on the eve, they actually incited Israel to aggression. And now, as it may not seem surprising and strange, they are addressing demands to the Iranians to return, as they formulate this, to the negotiating table. We are anxiously following the relentless military actions, which resulted in numerous civilian casualties. We consider the attacks of the Israeli country on peaceful nuclear facilities in the Islamic Republic of Iran categorically unacceptable. This is illegal from the point of view of international law. It creates unacceptable threats to international security and pushes the world towards a nuclear catastrophe, the consequences of which, God forbid, of course, will be felt everywhere, including in Israel itself. Russia calls on the Israeli leadership to immediately stop raids on nuclear installations and sites that are under safeguards and are the objects of verification activities of the MGATE, especially concerned about the safety of the Bushehr nuclear power plant, which involves Russian specialists. The harsh and irreconcilable reaction of the world's majority countries to Israeli strikes on the territory of Iran, including nuclear energy infrastructure, coupled with the results the emergency meeting of the UN Security Council on June 13th and the special session of the EIA Board of Governors on June 16th, testify to the rejection of the confrontational course and destructive actions of the Israeli leadership. They find support and understanding only from those states that are its actual accomplices. For today, the main thing is to prevent the spiral of violence from further unwinding, to achieve a ceasefire, restore peace, which in turn will create prerequisites for the return of the situation to the negotiating track. We are ready to contribute to this in every possible way and are making political and diplomatic efforts in this direction. As is known, on the first day of the hot phase of the conflict, Russian President Vladimir Putin had telephone conversations with the Prime Minister of Israel, the President of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The next day, as you know, the President of Russia spoke with the President of the United States. Then, there were contacts with the President of Turkey, the President of the United Arab Emirates. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held telephone conversations with the foreign ministers of Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Oman. The current crisis in the Middle East was also touched upon in a telephone conversation between the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Foreign Minister of Azerbaijan during negotiations with the Foreign Minister of Indonesia. As you know, these high-level talks between the foreign ministers and telephone contacts are continuing, even right now at these very hours. We hope that the understanding that there is no alternative to finding mutually acceptable negotiated solutions to the existing problems that exist today will prevail. We will continue to support the goals of the settlement around the Iranian nuclear program with due reliance on international law, the principle of equal and indivisible security, as well as with mutual consideration and a balanced balance of interest. We would like to warn Washington in particular against military intervention in the situation, which would be an extremely dangerous step with truly unpredictable negative consequences. Russia notes the Iranian country's clear statements about its unwavering commitment to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and its readiness to resume US contacts to work out possible solutions that remove any unfounded suspicions and prejudices regarding Tehran's nuclear program, provided that Israeli attacks cease. Moscow supports this attitude and firmly believes that the desired settlement can be reliably secured only through diplomacy and negotiations. The goals of nuclear non-proliferation, the fundamental basis of which is the end, should not be achieved through aggression and at the cost of innocent victims. Now about the work that Russian diplomacy is also doing to facilitate the departure of Russian citizens, by the way, not only Russian citizens, from the unsafe and now very dangerous zones and territories mentioned above. Our embassies, our consulates general are engaged in this, naturally, with the coordinating role of the Central Office of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In the context of a sharp escalation between Iran and Israel, the exchange of strikes, the closure of airspace, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, the Russian embassies in Iran, Israel, Iraq, Kuwait, Turkey, and other countries are engaged in ensuring the speedy departure of the delegation and temporarily seconded employees of Russian departments, organizations, and economic experts, as well as family members of the staff of the Foreign Office, institutions. In total, since June 14th, about 550 people have left Iran for Azerbaijan and Armenia for departure from Baku and Yerevan, including the filming group of Fyodor Bondarchuk and Tchaikovsky orchestras, and the chairman of the Gorchakov Foundation, oil shift workers, tourist groups, citizens of our country. More than 125 people left Israel. These are musical groups, pilgrims, and tourists. For departure. They left for departure from the airports of Egypt and Jordan. Citizens of Belarus, Serbia, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan were supported. According to the recommendations of the Ministry of Economic Development of Russia, tour operators have suspended the sale of tours in Iran, Israel. There are no more than a dozen organized Russian tourists left. Currently, Iran's exit routes are available as follows: through the border crossings of Stara with Azerbaijan and Gora with Armenia. When choosing, you should take into account the location, security risks on the road, logistics of course, travel time to the nearest international airport, and other factors. We publish practical recommendations and warnings. They have already been published, and will continue to be published in the Telegram channels of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Russian embassies in Tehran, Yerevan. We publish links to these resources in the text version of the briefing necessarily. In addition, there are 3 round-the-clock border crossings to Turkey: Gerbulik Bazargan, KPK Rosi, Sndrsro. It is possible to leave Israel through a checkpoint with Egypt, Menem Begin Tobacco around the clock, and Jordan River, Sheikh Hussein Bridge from 9 in the morning to 1600, as well as Allenby, King Hussein Bridge from 8 in the morning to 1400, as well as Yitzhak Rabin Wadi Arab from 8 in the morning to 2000. Up to 20 direct flights a day operate from Baku to Russia. They are carried out by Aeroflot, the company Russia, and Rera Azerbaijan Airlines. There are also up to 20 flights from Yerevan from Aeroflot, UT, Ural Airlines, Flyvan, Armenia, Azimut, UT, Ural Airlines, Shirik Avia. There are 5 flights from Cairo to Moscow per week by Aeroflot, Egypt Air. Taking into account the rapidly changing situation, we strongly recommend that our citizens carefully monitor regularly updated messages and warnings on the internet resources of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I remind you once again, this is the official Telegram account of the Foreign Ministry. Of course, our website. These are our resources and websites and Telegram accounts of our embassies in the countries of the region, which I have just talked about. If necessary, you can contact the emergency telephones of the Russian embassy in Iran, Azerbaijan, Israel, Armenia, Egypt, Jordan. Well, of course, our other embassies also have telephones for communication. I mean about those emergency lines that are most relevant now. There is also a 24-hour hotline of the Department of the Institutional Crisis Center of the Russian Foreign Ministry, a mobile application assistant abroad. All the necessary data, I mean links, of course, will be duplicated in the text of today's briefing. Of course, we express our gratitude to the authorities of Iran, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Iraq for their assistance in organizing export events. We are sincerely grateful to our Azerbaijani partners for helping Russians returning home from Iran amid the critical escalation of the situation in the Middle East, especially in the first days, when everything had to be done literally from the wheels. We promptly solve all the necessary organizational and logistical issues from the side. As of today, more than 500,000 Russian citizens have crossed the Astern checkpoint of Azerbaijan's Iranian border, and they do not particularly note the cordiality, hospitality, assistance, support rendered to them on Azerbaijani soil. And, as is known, as a sign of sincere gratitude to the Azerbaijani people, the Tchaikovsky Grand Symphony Orchestra gave a free concert in Baku on June 17th. You know, it happens in an absolutely normal situation. Life, not burdened by conflicts, escalation, threats, emergencies. People can't find a common language and can't show humanity. And it happens the other way around, when everything is on fire, when no one understands whether he will stay alive or not. No one knows how to leave, how to get through to the closest people. This is the very situation that we were experiencing now, when people were in bomb shelters, in bunkers, in the basements of houses, and suddenly, this is a manifestation of true humanism, humanity, all the best that is inherent in a person, from all sides, and including from those to whom such assistance was provided. Here is a sign of sincere gratitude, after all, not only for myself, but for everyone who has been helped. They are helping and will help. The escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, which led to the closure of the airspace of most countries in the region, put the crews of Russian passenger planes in the air in a difficult situation, to put it mildly. Of course, it's also a big question when it all started. Have those who carried out all this ever thought about it? Among them was the aircraft of the airline Siberia, which was heading to Novosibirsk in Dubai, but was forced to change the route and request an emergency landing at the Ashgabat International Airport on June 13th. We are deeply grateful to the Turkmen side for the prompt response In the current difficult situation, the assistance provided to passengers and the crew of the Russian airliner, we once again urge Russian citizens to refrain from traveling to Iran and Israel until the situation normalizes, and those in the region to leave dangerous areas. If it is impossible to do this, take maximum personal security measures, do not approach military facilities, critical infrastructure facilities, do not take photos and videos, avoid crowded places, follow the instructions of the authorities to immediately go to shelter or shelters. I repeat once again, we promptly publish relevant information on our resources. We turn to the situation around Ukraine. Russia has almost completed the implementation of the humanitarian package of agreements reached following the second round of direct talks with the Ukrainian side in Istanbul on June 2nd this year. As a gesture of goodwill, as you know, the repatriation of more than 6,000 bodies has been organized. I can even clarify the figure. 6,060 bodies of the dead servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine. 78 bodies of our fighters were handed over to us, the Russian side. The Russian Defense Ministry has confirmed its readiness to transfer another 2,239 bodies of Ukrainian military to the Ukrainian side. The parity exchange of seriously ill and wounded, as well as young soldiers under the age of 25, continues. Let me remind you, these were all initiatives of the Russian side. It goes through several stages. It is expected that at least 1,000 people will return home from each side. The substantive work on the received list of 339 Ukrainian children has started. Let me remind you, there are no stolen, no abducted, no forcibly displaced, taken out. They came up with something there, those who cannot reunite with their parents, who are being searched for, about whom there is no information. A tragedy. But this tragedy, unfortunately, happens in different countries, in different cities, even very prosperous ones. And what can we say about the territory that has been under the shelling of the Kiev regime for so many years? Since 2000 of the 14th year, after the 22nd of June, our delegation, I mean the delegation of the Russian Federation, which was approved by the decision of the president of our country, will be ready to arrive in Istanbul to continue negotiations. Specific deadlines, a lot of questions are being received, will be determined in the near future and, of course, voiced by representatives and leaders of the delegation itself, at least for the next third round. We mean to exchange comments on the memoirs of the parties, transmitted on May 28th and June 2nd, with proposals for resolving the Ukrainian crisis. Russia's conscientious implementation of the Istanbul agreements caused, as you probably noticed, in Kiev, literally a fit of rage, if not to say a frenzy. The comments are beyond cynicism. Everyone distinguished themselves, both functionaries and, unfortunately, journalists from the other side. One of the TV presenters of Channel 24 literally claimed, imagine, that there were allegedly no 6,000 bodies of the Ukrainian military. Ostensibly, that all this was invented by Moscow, and a myth, but in reality, as she said, in Russia. I gain some inner courage every time to say it, but I have to do it, because these are direct quotes. So, according to her, allegedly to increase the number of transferred bodies in Russia, according to her, they were engaged in dismemberment of corpses, parts of which were then laid out in different bags. Moreover, in the territory of our newly reunited regions, according to a Ukrainian journalist, mass exhumations of local residents who had previously died and buried there before the start of a special military operation were allegedly carried out. Similar measures. Can you imagine what this painful thought came to? They were, as she said, planned in nature, and pursued the goal of demonstrating to the population the scale of the problem and provoking protests, achieving the overthrow of the government. Without 6,000 bodies, she did not notice the scale of the problem in Ukraine all these years. It seems that they show the scale of the problem to their own population, however. They blame the Russian side for this, and now suddenly there is no scale of the problem. In the same odious logic, the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, Klimenko, thinks this. He took it upon himself to accuse our country of deliberately complicating the identification process of the dead soldiers transferred to the Ukrainian side. That is, at first they refused to take it, and then they said that we were complicating something, do you know? But this is gibberish. This is something in general, some kind of, you know, devilish muttering that we hear endlessly from them. What? What did he agree to? Let me remind you, this is the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine. Allegedly, the bodies are returned in an extremely disfigured state and body parts in different bags. Well, an adult can say this, especially a representative, the head of a power structure, and the people who died during, as a result of the fighting. But this is not the bottom. Here's what I'm going to tell you the following from his statements. This was, of course, some kind of nightmare for me in general. The Interior Minister of Ukraine said that the bodies were mixed. The bodies of Ukrainians with the bodies of Russians. When his own journalists asked him to clarify, but how did he determine this? He couldn't answer. But I think it's already to the doctor, I'm honest, that's the truth. But Zelensky surpassed him. Although much too much. Being in Austria on the 16th of June, he just had business there. He said that Russia allegedly offered to exchange Ukrainian children for Russian military. Well, the fact that he is in a strange state, we periodically see it already from video materials. But to lie like that, I really don't know what drugs I should be under. This is a blatant, cynical, terrible lie. Probably, again, aimed at undermining the Istanbul processes, the mediation efforts of those countries that contribute to this process. But there must be some kind of logic. If 339 names have only been transferred, what else is there to invent? That someone put some conditions on him there, offered to change something. It would be better to explain why in a few months, literally, the figure from 20,000 children suddenly mutated into 339. I want to emphasize once again that Russia does not kidnap, deport, or forcibly move children, especially not change them for prisoners of war, for anyone. Our fighters risking themselves save children, and they save them without asking whose you will be, what passport or birth certificate you have, what blood flows in you, what nationality or religion you will be. The main thing is to save the child. They are being taken out of the combat areas, and our children's ombudsman, the Commissioner for the Rights of the Child for the President of Russia, Maria Lvova-Belova, with the mediation of Qatar in Belarus, a number of other countries, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, is doing the most difficult work to reunite Ukrainian and Russian children with their families. Let me remind you that today, 101 Ukrainian children from 81 families, more than 80 families, have been reunited with relatives in Ukraine and in other countries. And 22 children from 15 families returned to Russia from Ukraine. I would also like to note that desperate Ukrainian citizens have repeatedly applied to Russian diplomatic missions, from whom children of special service in Western European countries are being seized. They turn to Russia because the embassies of Ukraine refuse them even to discuss this issue. They refer to certain political circumstances. Well, that's right, and I'll explain what kind of political circumstances these are if the embassy of Ukraine in the EU countries sends a diplomatic note or raises the question of finding Ukrainian children on the territory of EU countries. It means that the myth that all children allegedly disappear because of Russia, in Russia, or there with the participation of Russia, it will be brought down, it will disappear. These are the political circumstances. But in fact, the meanness of the highest brand, the highest standard, they are the ones who take care of their children, as if they are taking care of them. It would probably be possible for them to write it off once again as some kind of Russian propaganda. But in April of the 24th year, the commissioner of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine for Human Rights Lyubinets announced statistics in an interview in the national media. 255 children were removed from Ukrainian families in European countries. This is only the official data announced by him. Special attention deserves published on the 17th of April last year. Again, the news agency of Microinform of the National Police of Ukraine that more than 160 Ukrainian children, which on bank claimed they were allegedly taken to Russia or Russia, was unexpectedly found in Germany. Everything will be known. Everything will come out. The truth will prevail. And everyone will be horrified by the level of lies and hypocrisy that was spread to the banks. Obviously, we are dealing with another orchestrated company to denigrate Russia. Other cases were fabricated according to similar patterns, staged in a butch with loud headlines in the Western media, without facts, without evidence, just slogans. I repeat once again, our country throughout history, it was not only in these days, in these years, it has always been so. It showed humanism, again in the best sense of the word. Treptow Park, remember the monument that is installed there. This is not just a Soviet soldier. This is not just a Soviet soldier holding a child in his arms. This is not just a Soviet soldier holding a German girl in his arms. This is a fixation of a historical fact. These soldiers and these children had names. Well, actually, the terrorist nature of the Kiev regime is already well known to everyone, but I will give facts, figures and data, confirming our characteristics of this regime every time. After all, they tried their best to overshadow the events, including the 12th of June, the Day of Russia. The terror of Bandera was directed against the civilian population and civilian objects of the Russian regions. Over the past week, 104 people suffered from their shelling, 8 people were killed, including 1 minor. 96 people were injured, including 14 children and teenagers. In the Kursk region, on June 9th, a civilian was killed in the village of Prigorodnaya Slobodka. 5 more people were injured. On the 10th of June, in the village of Sheptukovka, as a result of an explosion on a Ukrainian Mini. 2 combined harvesters received thermal burns after enemy drone strikes on the village of Mariana. 3 children, aged 7, 9, 13, were injured. The glazing of 2 paramedic obstetric stations was damaged. Where are all these Western brethren who supply money and weapons to the Kiev regime? Where are the non-governmental organizations of Western countries that constantly say that they are concerned about the fate of children? They don't care about anything. Cultural centers and sanatoriums suffered from these attacks. Broken windows in an elementary school. On the 11th of June, a Ukrainian drone chasing a civilian car injured the driver in the Paradise district. On the 10th of June in Belgorod, as a result of a drone hitting a gas station, 1 person was killed and 5 were injured. In Shebekino, Belgorod region, on June 11th, 6 civilians were injured as a result of a drone strike on the territory of a local enterprise. On June 12th, a 2-year-old child was killed in the village of Borisovka as a result of an attack by an APU drone. His grandmother was hospitalized in a serious condition in the Bryansk region. On the 11th of June, the APU attacked the village of Baraklav with drones. 2 people were injured. On the 15th of June, a Ukrainian drone hit a civilian car in the village of Podlesny Novoselky. A local resident was injured. In the DPIE, from the 9th to the 15th of June, at least 14 people were injured, including 6 teenagers. One employee of the Ministry of Emergency Situations. On June 12th, in Makyevka, on the territory of the Garden Association, as a result of an explosion on an anti-personnel mini-petal, a woman 1957th year of birth was seriously injured. On the 13th of June, a married couple died as a result of an attack by the AFU on the same locality, with shrapnel ammunition of the HIMARS Mors, a man of 77th year of birth, a woman of the 80th. On the morning of the 17th of June, the Chronozists targeted a residential apartment building in the Leninsky district of Donetsk with M31 fragmentation missiles from the Arso HIMARS. 14 people were injured. In the LPR on June 14th, a 17-year-old teenager was injured as a result of a drone attack in the Kherson region. On the 11th of June, a resident of the settlement of Proletarka was injured due to the shelling of the FSU. Forest fires broke out because of this. The total area of the fire was 43 hectares. A power line of 150 kilowatts was damaged. 392 settlements, more than 250,000 inhabitants, were left without electricity. On the 12th of June, 2 people were injured in the village of Rivne as a result of an APU strike, including a 79-year-old woman in Oleshki. The enemy fired at the ambulance. On the 14th of June, 1 person suffered from the actions of the APU in Novaya Kakhovka. In Tatarstan, on June 15th, as a result of a strike by Ukrainian drones on an automobile plant in the Yelabuga district, 18 people were injured, 2 of whom died under the wreckage of drones that fell on a car park near the checkpoint. 3 children are among the wounded. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the presentation of the next report of the International Public Tribunal for Crimes of Ukrainian Neo-Nazis, Atrocities and War Crimes of the Kiev regime in Dzerzhinsk will take place today at the Press Center of NE Russia on June 26th at 11 o'clock. I invite you, representatives of Russian and foreign media, to take part in this event. But there are punishments for all this. Russian courts continue to sentence Ukrainian neo-Nazis and mercenaries for other war crimes. For the armed blocking of the village of Olga in the coup of the Kursk region, the militants of the AFU Kazemyak, Shvedova, and Tsekhovsky were sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. Everyone was given 15 years. Belinsky, Yemelyanov, Nazarenko, Rozhkov, Svili received 16 years each for crimes in the Glushkovsky district of the Kursk region, including for keeping the village of Novi put under illegal armed control. 6 Ukrainian servicemen of the 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade on Gornaya Kapchenko-Mashiko were sentenced to 16.5 years in prison. Rafalyuk, Shapelo, Yatskovsky, 16 years old, for blocking the village of Pogrebki in the Kursk region. A prison sentence was passed against the soldiers of the 95th Separate Airborne Assault Brigade of the AFU Rustemev, 16 years old, and Saul, 15 years old. In absentia, the mercenary of the publication, Annabelle Jorgensen, was sentenced to 26 years in prison. A sentence of 28 years in prison was handed down to the Colombian mercenary, Pablo Poets Borges, who was captured in the Kursk region. Well, that's about Western curators. On June 12th, German Defense Minister Pistorius paid an unannounced visit to Kiev. His task was to check the clock on current areas of German and European assistance, with an emphasis on industrial military cooperation. Pistorius announced possible additional support to Ukraine in the amount of about 2 billion euros. That is 48 billion euros since the beginning of a special military operation. He admitted that the funds could be directed, among other things, to the production of long-range missiles on its territory. Of course, this is what is needed now to literally finish off the citizens of Ukraine in every sense. Berlin's militaristic background provokes disapproval, growing disapproval in Germany itself. Look, according to polls, 63% of Germans are categorically against the supply of cancer toros. 55% of German residents reject plans for joint production of long-range systems. I would like to say one more thing about the plans of the UN NATO to increase the so-called defense capability of Ukraine. Well, that is, if we speak in our own words, and as it really is, how they dig the grave of the citizens of Ukraine. On the 12th of June in Rome, the foreign ministers transformed the Vermeer Plus. How many formats they have done there? Fantastic. And these are Germany, Britain, Spain, Italy, Poland, and France, in the company of the NATO Secretary General, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs. The security issue of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine called for strengthening the armed forces and expanding cooperation with Kiev in the field of the military-industrial complex in order to increase defense capability. Do you think Ukraine? No. Europe. In the face of the alleged Russian threat. But the president of Russia spoke about this myth in great detail, communicating on the sidelines of the forum with representatives of foreign mass media. Of course, there were also statements in Rome that we need to increase pressure, that we need more sanctions. Well, in general, we need to rally and, so to speak, strengthen our positions. It does not matter that they do not bring results, as the president of Russia also said yesterday. But, as they say, apparently they like it. And of course, to show us the finishing touch to these militaristic attempts and this aggressive portrait of modern Western Europe are the latest data from the Celtic Institute of World Economy from June 16th. So, according to his calculations, once again the institute is not ours. The total amount of EU military assistance to the Kiev regime has reached 72 billion euros, while the United States has submitted 65 billion euros. A record increase in funding occurred in March-April. But now compare these amounts with the loss of benefits that the EU and NATO members inflicted on themselves, simply losing the normal opportunity for trade with our country and with other countries. They now also have sanctions indirectly. Can you imagine what these numbers are? They still could not find a couple of million for a decade to help those in need somewhere on other continents, which they cared so much about. There have never been enough forces to solve, for example, issues with, for example, clean water in African countries, or with medical problems in the countries of the Asian continent. They always talked about it. They always talked about raising funds. These Western countries tried to do something at the on-site, but it didn't work out. You will see what gigantic sums are literally in a matter of seconds over these few years for the needs of exactly the opposite. Not to cure, but to cripple. Not to promote fertility health, but to kill. Not to educate, but to do so that generations could not raise their heads. So many problems have been created by him. It's fantastic. And of course, the 7 in Canada did not end as Zelensky expected. Well, not only was there not the very meeting that he expected with Trump, but they could not get what they got. They could not enlist the consent of the Allies on the issue of allocating the next billions of annual budget support to ensure, as they put it there, the resilience of Ukraine. As you know, the final joint statement on the 7 on Ukraine was not adopted. In general, Zelensky, who was not slurping with salt, left home. In general, a good article came out, oddly enough, because there are different articles coming out there, this time, objectively, in the publication of the politician Ilkin Nureyev, is a well-known employee of the famous German foundation, Alexander von Gumbelt, on June 17th. Just the other day she published this article. It stresses that the West will not be able to help Ukraine when the conflict and victory on the battlefield has ceased to be a realistic goal for the Kiev regime, regardless of how many billions more the West allocates. But again, I spoke about this yesterday with the facts in the hands of the President of the Russian Federation. No matter how much and what they supply, they will still not be able to achieve these mythical goals of inflicting strategic defeat on us, of defeating this very neo-Nazism in Ukraine, and so on. The author notes that literally a direct quote is an unpopular point of view in Washington or Brussels, but even there it is increasingly recognized as realistic. And, in his opinion, the best way to support Kiev is to help not in the continuation of hostilities, but in their cessation, without losing the future of this country. In the current situation, the preservation of Ukraine's sovereignty and the stabilization of the political situation in Europe depends not so much on weapons as on diplomacy. To be honest, I would like to add just common sense, but I think everyone understands this anyway. The continuation of the conflict threatens to exhaust Ukraine, destroy Western unity, and strengthen Russia. This, I want to say again, is an expert of the German Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. But against this background, some kind of maniacal desire of the Kiev regime continues to continue the fight against historical memory, which we regularly talk about, but also, of course, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has a special reason, along with forceful methods. Threats of forced mobilization of clergy representatives have now been used for this. The State Service of Ukraine for Ethnopolitics, as it calls itself, for freedom of conscience, it's all the same name, has approved a list of religious organizations that, direct quote, are critically important for the functioning of the economy, ensuring the vital activity of the population in a special period, and the clergy of which, accordingly, will be entitled to a reservation from the recruitment of the armed forces. You know I'm going to talk, you know, here you are in such and such a cassock, who has crosses here and here. And here you are, who has there, I do not know, some other markings or other traditional symbols of other religions. You please go to the left side of the room, you will have a reservation. And here you represent other currents of world religions. Well, I don't know, here you are, you please, to the right side of the room, you will be mobilized. Where have you seen this? That's what kind of country, what kind of regime has ever thought of such a thing? If we had seen this in some movie, or read it in some novel, we would have thought that this is absolute fiction, not scientific, which can never be realized. But this is life already. What do you think? There are more than 7,000 organizations that will have the right to armor. Naturally, representatives of the so-called Orthodox Church of Ukraine were included in the list in full. Uniates, Protestants, Evangelicals, Adventists, Neo-Pagans, and other communities. There was not a single structure in this list that belongs to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. In order to avoid mobilization, the priests of the canonical church are offered a direct quote. I think you guessed what to do, voluntarily go along with coming to the PCU. Well, what kind of characteristic can be chosen for this? Change the jurisdiction and then the reservation will appear. But in fact, military enlistment offices, after all, have long been used by Ukrainian clerics to approach the clergy of the WAC. Now they will simply have absolutely free hands, and in case of forced mobilization of the clergy, they will simply be forcibly taken away more often. But there are examples. On the 11th of June, Archpriest Alexander Zhuk, rector of the village church of the WAC, was detained in Rivne and hastily sent after the military medical commission. On the same day, in the Ternopil region, military commissars, seized the rector of the Pachiv Holy Spirit Monastery, Archimandrite Paphnutius. I do not know of such examples anymore. These facts, of course, once again confirm the actual special military operations for denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine, in eliminating threats emanating from its territory. The Russian leadership has repeatedly said about the fulfillment of these tasks and goals that they will be fulfilled. But there is also a very important topic that I would like to touch upon today. We have paid attention to media reports in the Sol states about the direct involvement of the Kiev regime, the Ukrainian special services, the preparation of tourist elements that operate in the Sahara of the Sol region. Last week, mail-in and second-hand news portals, citing official sources, stated the involvement of Ukrainian intelligence in providing assistance to the terrorist group Islam and Muslim Support Group, which on May 30th carried out an attack on the positions of the armed forces of Ali in the Kulakaro region. We are talking about the supply of drones by the Kiev regime to terrorists through the territory of one of the neighboring countries, the provision of intelligence, the organization of training events. According to available information, during the counter-terrorist operation, the Malian Defense and Security Forces discovered compromising documents belonging to the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. An unmanned aerial vehicle with identifying inscriptions in Ukrainian was also captured. The Kiev regime continues to demonstrate its terrorist nature, even outside of its country. His ties with African terrorists were confirmed earlier, including by the press secretary of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Andrei Yusov, and the ambassador of Ukraine to Senegal, Yuri Pivovarov. They publicly stated the facts of assistance to terrorist forces that carried out an attack on a convoy of Malian military personnel in northern Mali at the end of July of the 24th year. The authenticity of their statements was also confirmed by the government of Mali and Niger, which eventually decided to immediately, as you remember, break off diplomatic relations with Ukraine in August of the 24th year. Ali, Niger, and Burkina Faso soon appealed to the UN Security Council, demanding that measures be taken in connection with the Kiev regime's support for terrorism on the African continent. Zelensky's gang continues to use terrorist methods on the territory of our country, as we regularly inform you, and you yourself know, including regular attacks on civilian infrastructure facilities. Yes, they are retreating under the onslaught of the Russian armed forces. Apparently, they have decided to open a second front in Africa now, stimulating tourist activity there in friendly African states. It should also be noted that the connivance of the British-EU tandem is a crime of the Kiev regime. For a whole year since the tragedy in Mali, no Western power has condemned the Kiev regime's support of terrorist groups, even when the Africans themselves pointed it out. The current reaction of the Western bloc to the terrorist attacks committed by Ukrainian foreign Nazis on the territory of Russia also fits into this strategy of criminal cover-up in their wards. The entire responsibility for the proliferation of the terrorist threat lies with the Neo-Bandera regime, its Western accomplices, as accomplices of the crimes being committed. As you know, we issue, the Foreign Ministry issues reports, thematic reports on human rights, and of course, the situation around Ukraine required, well, just so much data and facts for the release and preparation of specialized thematic reports. A report on the human rights situation in Ukraine has been prepared. The numerous facts of human rights violations confirm that by now the situation in this area in Ukraine has simply degraded. It is quite obvious that the Kiev regime, which has usurped power, is now increasingly showing its outright Nazi essence, committing countless gross violations of human rights in all spheres of public life. In the country, I mean in Ukraine, a political dictatorship has actually been established. Legal lawlessness and lawlessness reign. In addition, various manifestations of neo-Nazism are intensifying in Ukraine, including aggressive propaganda of this ideology, falsification of the history of the Great Patriotic War, World War, in order to glorify the Nazis, their accomplices, and the cultivation of nationalist sentiments among the population. Accordingly, the presented report contains a large number of facts confirming all this glorification of the Nazi criminal bandera in various ways, heroization, the SS Division Galicia, which is banned in the Russian Federation, honoring the few survivors of former Nazis. The Nazi approaches of the Kiev regime are fully implemented in relation to the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. By now, as you know, everything Russian is banned in this country. language, culture, education, printed materials, mass media. A course has been taken to liquidate the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. What does that mean? It's not the form that is being destroyed. The essence is being destroyed. An unprecedented campaign is underway to forcibly seize the churches of the WAC by militants, with the support of local authorities, of course, with the subsequent legalization of the results of such an action, and distortion of the essence of their purpose. What is not being carried out there already? Then cooking shows, then some dances, then some gatherings, rallies, and so on. The most surprising thing is that before that, the monuments to the heroes of the Great Patriotic War and everything connected with the great victory, Zelensky demolished or allowed to demolish or indicated that they should be demolished under the pretext of decommunization. So, if you take, well, of course, it's not true. They just had to erase the entire history of the Great Patriotic War at the Western behest, rewrite it anew. So it's amazing and fantastic. And it's impossible to understand that on the one hand they are carrying out some kind of alleged decommunization, and on the other hand, in the sphere of religion, they are using real measures that were used in the worst sense of the word, with all the communist excesses against the clergy, the church, representatives of, so to speak, the world religions and confessions. How can this be? How does it all fit into one head? On the one hand, decommunization, and on the other hand, they use methods that were used during, I say again, that period, and which were then, I don't know, not recognized. How to say, somewhere criminal, somewhere unacceptable countries that used to be republics. People, public organizations, were censured.
Странами, которые раньше были республиками, людьми, общественными организациями, порицали.
In other words, this is some kind of absolutely not even flawed, but a painful inconsistency, some kind of dichotomy in fact, which is going on in the heads of these people at the bank. As I have already said, and say regularly, the WAC has actually declared a hunt for a clergyman with groundless criminal prosecution, with the forcible mobilization of the armed forces of Ukraine, which we have just talked about. Moreover, the Kiev regime is being reborn, and has already been reborn, into a tourist organization, and commits numerous crimes against Russian civilians, residents of the Belgorod, Bryansk, Zaporozhye, Kursk, Kherson regions, Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and other districts and regions of Russia. Other cities, settlements are also objects of tourist aspirations of the Kiev regime. It is not surprising that the use of the widest range of repressive measures against a significant number of the population is necessary for the banking system, as the only and at the same time the surest way to maintain power. It is important for them to continue the war, maintain a high degree of escalation in society, redirect attention to external confrontation, stop all this, establish peace, will obviously lead to the need to somehow explain their own population, and from the point of view of its own legitimacy, and from the point of view of crimes, and not just unfulfilled promises, but perversions of these promises beyond recognition. But the power for them, and its preservation, apparently, is more important than the world, than the lives of people, if they consider them to be people at all, judging by the way they treat both the living and now the dead. Numerous information about the terrorist and war crimes of the Kiev regime against the civilian population of Donbass and Ukraine. In this report, I emphasize, does not include in Russia similar crimes committed by the Kiev military political leadership, nationalists, representatives of Ukrainian law enforcement agencies, since 2000 of the 14th year, as well as against residents of Russia are recorded and investigated with our law enforcement agencies. The investigative committee of the Russian Federation, first of all, several thousand criminal cases have been opened and are being investigated. So please do not be surprised that these data are not there. This is for another diocese. About 500 defendants, members of the Ukrainian armed formations, have already been sentenced to long terms of imprisonment, including life imprisonment. Russian civil society organizations are making significant efforts to document such crimes. Today, I have already announced another event on their line, which reveal the essence of the Nazi essence of the Kiev regime, speak and name the facts of their crimes, and information about these crimes is included in separate analytical materials. We have repeatedly stressed that it is precisely Zelensky's obliging willingness to move the country along the path of self-destruction to the detriment of the interests of his people, creating a Russophobic anti-Russia project out of it. That is the reason why foreign curators turn a blind eye to the neo-Nazi essence of the Kiev regime. Its numerous crimes contribute to its withdrawal from the control of international human rights monitoring mechanisms. History knows many examples of such connivance of the West by the openly Russian and Nazi regime. And the Second World War is probably one of the brightest examples here. Well, there were so many of them after the Second World War. Here's another one. And here's to the question of more, including the problems of children, in the development of the results of the second round of Russian-Ukrainian negotiations, which we talked about today. I mean those that took place in Istanbul, on the initiative of our country. A draft statement by the chairman of the Security Council on Children, in the context of the Ukrainian crisis, was submitted to the UN-Security Council for consideration. The document welcomed the readiness of the Russian side to carefully study the list of 339 Ukrainian children transferred by Kiev, who, due to various circumstances, lost contact with relatives and legal representatives, and, if necessary, take measures to restore family ties. Among other things, Russia's intention was noted to organize this process in the most transparent way possible, with the transfer to the UN-Security Council of all information received as a result of processing the Ukrainian list. And Kiev, the Ukrainian side, Kiev was called upon to cooperate in good faith with the Russian side on this issue. It would seem that everything that is needed in the draft document is there, but contrary to common sense, and despite the obvious humanitarian nature of the initiative, the Western members of the UN-Security Council, namely Britain, Greece, Denmark, Slovakia, France, as well as South Korea, decided to actually block the adoption of the document. What did they do before that? They fed it with biased, politicized formulations, recalled this old song, and began to include calls for an immediate ceasefire. Well, in general, they turned a humanitarian project that was really dedicated to the fate of children into some kind of politicized story, with such an unconstructive approach, when it was clear that no one cared about children again from Western humanists. The Russian delegation had no choice but to curtail work on the document. There is another evidence of double standards or lack of standards, hypocrisy of the Kiev regime and its masters, who continue to disperse the myth of allegedly thousands of abducted and forcibly displaced Ukrainian children. This is when the documents they handed over to us say the opposite. We have once again seen, and now the world has already seen, how this humanitarian topic turns into an element of Russophobia, anti-Russian propaganda, in front of the eyes of the world community. I'm not going to talk about what we talked about a lot today, but there is not the slightest doubt that nobody really cares about children there. And all of this is exclusively politicized tools. The Russian Federation has never interfered, and will never interfere, hinder the maintenance of contacts and communication of children with their relatives, loved ones. There is no such example. No one will ever be able to bring him. We sincerely strive to reunite children with their parents and legal representatives, and we will continue to do everything necessary to provide assistance and social support to children who have found themselves in the most difficult living conditions due to the criminal actions of the Kiev regime and Westerners covering it. You know what kind of example I will help you to give. 5 years ago, a pandemic, lockdowns, we, the foreign ministry, and the whole country are engaged in the assistance in the export of Russian citizens. We are approached by citizens of Ukraine who are also asking for Russian on board Russian planes who want to return to Russia through Russia. What are they saying? They say they have. They talked, and we have it all recorded. And they said that they appealed to Ukrainian embassies, to Ukrainian diplomats with a request to help reach Ukraine by, so to speak, using Russian assistance, which was open, which was provided, and Ukrainian diplomatic missions refused Ukrainian citizens, including socially unprotected groups, because they did not want to turn to Russia. Even at the embassy level. That, you see, is the truth. That's what the whole story is about. By the way, there is also a similar example. The Russian side took the initiative to adopt a Security Council resolution in connection with the terrorist attacks that were committed by the Kiev regime at the end of May at the beginning of June in the Bryansk, Kursk, Voronezh regions. The draft was distributed again. Among the members of the Security Council it was distributed, and it was built on the formulations approved for such documents. Terrorist attacks, sabotage, and other acts of international terrorism that pose a threat to peace and security on the planet were strongly condemned. Deep sympathy was expressed to the victims, condolences to the relatives of the deceased. A call was addressed to the state members to jointly bring to justice the perpetrators, organizers, sponsors of these crimes. Here's what could have gone wrong. And it went wrong again because the Western members of the Security Council refused to work on the document again under a far-fetched pretext. I'm not going to say how. I think that you followed the discussion around this issue as well. The Russian country also showed flexibility, proposed to adopt a press statement of a similar content instead of a resolution, so that the work would not stall, and this undertaking came across the same approach. The opposition of Westerners, who united against it. They have discredited themselves again. Now they are publicly showing their engagement to everyone. It seems that for many decades we have been against international terrorism and terrorism as a phenomenon. Now everyone again does not see, does not notice, does not understand. The background, of course, is obvious. There is no doubt in anyone's mind that the traces of inhumane barbaric terrorist attacks on Russian territory lead to Bankovaya. The European sponsors of the Ukrobanderites have been turning a blind eye to any, even the most brutal atrocities of the Kiev junta since the 14th year. Many terrorist attacks were directly involved, as, for example, the British. And now they are using the Kiev regime as their tools, in no way denying the terrorist essence. I mean not shying away, and not even trying to somehow dissociate themselves from terrorist acts, not a single word of condemnation. In fact, there can be no justification for terrorism, and therefore we urge all responsible members of the international community to give a proper assessment of what happened, not to allow connivance to the Kiev regime, which has relied on terror. Here is the situation in Moldova. We are closely monitoring what is happening there. The ruling elites continue to consistently destroy bilateral relations, contrary to the hopes of Moldovan citizens, who want to interact with their neighbors, with Russia, to build relations, develop cooperation. They also destroy the spiritual and moral foundation of Moldovan society, impose neoliberal values, revisionist views. Sometimes there is a feeling that, well, that's it, it can't be any worse. Well, it's true, but it's worse that they rewrote the Moldovan language, calling it Romanian, and Moldovans were recorded as Romanians. Well, it seems like nothing can be done. But no, every time something else is found, and there is a knock from below. Look, on June 15th, a peaceful action was held in Chisinau in defense of traditional values and the family. What could have gone wrong? But, as they say, it went again. It was attended by large families, young people, elderly people, church servants. About 10,000 people defended traditional values and the family. Security forces attacked an Orthodox priest. There was a rough detention of a man with a child in his arms. The pro-government Moldovan media turned the situation inside out and presented it all as if the clergy themselves were trying to break through police cordons with icons in their hands. And in the official statement of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Moldova, Jesuit claims that the clashes were allegedly coordinated from the outside for internal political destabilization. In comments to numerous videos with the mentioned incidents, The viewers themselves, eyewitnesses, wrote that the rude actions of the police demonstrate the moral degradation of the authorities in Chisinau, are the result of the politicization of law enforcement agencies, which, instead of fighting real crime, serve the interests of the corrupt ruling regime. The opposition forces called the incident a planned action of the authorities to intimidate the people of Moldova on the eve of the parliamentary elections, and announced the initiation of a parliamentary investigation into the actions of the Moldovan Interior Ministry. We also intend to appeal to international human rights organizations. And what was caused, and what was the reason for the violence by the police? Let's figure it out, and everything is simple. On the same day, the so-called BT parade took place in Chisinau, the capital of Moldova. Its participants were carefully protected from citizens who adhered to traditional views. Despite the ban of the municipal authorities on holding this Sabbath, the patronage of President Sandu and the ruling Solidarity Action Party, as well as, of course, the embassies of Western countries. All this allowed a few local activists to pass freely through the central streets of Chisinau. And, as a matter of fact, it showed the true priorities of the current Moldovan authorities, for whom demonstrating their commitment to the notorious so-called European values to their sponsors is much more important than the opinion of the overwhelming majority of the country's residents who adhere to traditional views. 95% profess orthodoxy. Let me remind you, in Moldova, in line with the dominant trends in Europe today, official Chisinau consistently supports initiatives aimed at the actual whitewashing of Nazism. They are turning the Republic into a pantheon of Hitler's allies, another action to glorify the soldiers of Nazi Romania, who died as a result of and during the invasion of the Soviet Union. In the summer of the 41st year, took place on the 4th of June in the village of Stoyanovka, Kantemirovsky district. The ceremony was terrible to pronounce with all military honors, this in relation to collaborators, with the participation of even the military orchestra of the Ministry of Defense of Moldova, the district authorities, a representative of the Bessarabian metropolis. In the village of Dushmany of the Gladiansky district, with the support of local officials, they are preparing to open another memorial in honor of the so-called Romanian heroes. And these are actually not heroes at all, but occupiers from Antonescu's army, as well as criminals who ingloriously ended their way on Soviet soil. A direct consequence of the attempts to revive Nazism in modern Moldova is that local TV channels are increasingly making statements that are simply literally saturated with ethnic hatred. June 12th, a political scientist, I have already said this, a former deputy, ex-ambassador of Moldova to Russia, Siranu, speaking of Russian-speaking Moldovans, do you know what he called them? Well, I think you've seen. I'm sorry, but I have to quote it. Low-quality ethnic part of the population. What is this? This is Nazism, neo-Nazism. This is the segregation of people based on nationality. This is a derogatory attitude towards people of a different origin. Where is the reaction of the Moldovan authorities, who seem to be paying lip service to the notorious Euro values? No legal assessment. No assessment was given either by the law enforcement agencies of Moldova or by the politicians who are in power in this country. I think we won't see any reaction either. Well, actually, against the background of all of the above, the trend of catastrophic depopulation of Moldova is not surprising. During the reign of Sandu, and this, you know, is not decades, this is, the population of Moldova has decreased by about 10%. Wow, right, this is without any emergency situations. There were no hurricanes or typhoons, there were no volcanic eruptions, there was no fighting. Nothing like that. Fortunately, the majority of Moldovans have already developed a stable immunity against violent political endocrinization. They understand what kind of abyss their country and themselves will be in if they continue to follow the Western attitudes that the Sandu regime pushes through. But I think that nothing will work for this regime, And of course, from the category amazing next. On June 17th, the European Commission presented a draft EU regulation on the gradual final rejection of the import of Russian gas and oil. Found something to be proud of. Previously, we were proud of where we found cheaper resources, where we concluded contracts that were more stable and predictable. Today, it's the opposite. The document is intended to lay the legislative basis for the termination of gas supplies from Russia by the European Union under new contracts from the 1st of January of the 26th, under current short-term contracts from the 17th of June of the 26th year, and under long-term contracts from the 1st of January of the 28th year. The question arises, well, if you don't want to buy, then don't buy. Why this whole mess? And I remind you, here, for example, are the peaceful negotiations of Ukraine. Ukraine was banned from conducting, including fixing the ban by law. So it is here. Well, a normal society, the state, the company will not want to buy. It will not. But if the market situation changes, if suddenly there is a company, a state, a community, in the face of some extraordinary circumstances, they will have the opportunity to return to this issue. Why adopt legislation in this regard? It's not just countries, it's crazy, and simply by doing so, Brussels continues its course towards the complete curtailment of energy cooperation with our country, in their desire to make the confrontation and the break with Russia literally irreversible, plus, or completely lost touch with reality. They do not ask the question whether the population of their countries needs it. No, they dictate the will of people, companies and businesses, regardless of how much it corresponds to common sense. So much so that they are not even able to justify the need for the measures proposed for adoption, without resorting to outright distortion of facts and substitution of concepts. Judge for yourself. I'm just going to give you a few examples. Profile European Commissioner Dan Jorgensen says that the import of Russian gas is, judging by his statement, a threat to European security. He vows not to put any of the member states, and not to leave any of the member states of the European Union without energy. It is clear that stable, economically profitable energy supplies from our country, of course, have never threatened anyone for, well, probably more than half a century, even under different systems, when there was the Soviet Union, when there was the Western Camp, the Warsaw Pact, the confrontation of systems, the Cold War. No one refused Russian energy resources and did not invent a story that they threatened someone. On the contrary, they have always been the key to the long-term economic well-being of Western European countries. At the same time, it is deliberately silent about what kind of hole in the national budgets will be punched by the need to purchase the fallen energy from alternative sources. There may be energy carriers on the market. The only question is how much they cost and how much they will cost. Another example of this kind of verbal balancing act, which clearly smacks of nonsense. The claim that the less money is spent on Russian energy resources, the more the European Union will allegedly have funds to invest in what? In green projects. This is despite the fact that they are already restarting coal mines. In fact, by ceasing to buy Russian gas, the EU will not save, but on the contrary, will spend huge sums on its replacement. Scientists, economists, and power engineers all know this. Accordingly, it will become much more difficult to free up additional funds for investment, whether it is renewable energy sources or any important other areas. The European Commission also claim that stopping the import of Russian gas allegedly will not lead to significant economic consequences and risks of supply disruption. Apparently, the inevitable decline of the economy and production for the European Union, in this case, deindustrialization and aggravation of the problem of energy poverty, are considered by European officials as an insignificant price in the fight against the Russian threat, invented by them. In the same spirit, the explanation that the complete abandonment of Russian oil, which should also take place before the end of the 27th year, is unlikely to have a strong impact on oil prices and on global markets. In other words, look, when it is necessary to say that it is very profitable, they talk about how much money they will save. At the same time, they say that and all this will be completely insignificant and will not affect anything in principle. Some kind of, well, it's not just a mismatch, it's really already bipolar. Against the background of the declared confidence in the reliability of the strategy they have chosen, which is completely divorced from reality by European bureaucrats, it is noteworthy that in the regulations, it is impossible to believe, but it is true, after all, there is a possibility of temporary non-application of the ban on the import of Russian gas, in the event of some sudden and serious circumstances threatening the continuity of supplies to one or more EU member states. I'm sorry, you said that the threat is only from Russia. This is what kind of problems you may have, since you are so reliably protected from us. Remember how at first Zelensky, under pressure from Britain and the United States, banned negotiations and legislated it with a corresponding ban. And then 3 years later, when they started asking him, well, how is it? You kind of banned yourself from negotiating with Russia. And on the other hand, your negotiators again went to Istanbul to negotiate with the Russian side. What did Zelensky say? Do you remember this phrase? You know, like from some really humorous show. He said he didn't forbid himself anything. Well, they say that too. In this incomprehensible way, the European Union is sure that if something goes wrong, but suddenly, it will always be possible to apparently unscrew the valve back. But this, of course, is also evidence of not just the unreliability of the European Union as a consumer, it is evidence that they are generally unable to ensure the stability or predictability of their own legal framework for energy cooperation with third countries. Judging by their intentions to strengthen control over the concluded contracts, they also respect commercial secrets. This is a very good example for all other countries of how they can or cannot be dealt with. And of course, the cynicism of the strategy chosen by the European Commission to push through its destructive energy program in an attempt to circumvent the veto of some European capitals, many of which are well aware of how all this will turn out, that this is suicide, which is imposed by the Brussels bureaucracy. It was decided to develop this kind of regulatory act, for the adoption of which only a qualified most of them. I'm sorry, but what about European unity, as they say, and Euro-solidarity? Everything. Is it over? At the same time, the provisions of this document will have to be implemented by the Eurocapitals themselves, who are expected to develop specific action plans against you. For you, it doesn't matter. You'll be dealing with the consequences. In case of failure, the European Commission calmly washes its hands, and all the negative consequences will have to be dealt with by strange members, their leadership, and in fact not the leadership, people, citizens, business operators. The real affected party, it has already become familiar for many years, will be ordinary citizens of Western Europe, whose name Ursula von der Leyen and her team prefer to defiantly hide behind, and what opinion to neglect. No less demonstrative. And I would like to say a few words about that terrible, crazy information company that is gaining momentum in Britain in connection with some fires. It's just a detective story. Agatha Christie will be jealous. Over the past months, the top leaders of Britain have already seen a new story unfolding with the persistence of a worthy absolutely best application. The goal, obviously, of course, is to create a toxic image of Russia in general in public opinion, to renovate it, I would say, or update it, exploit the artificially created image of the enemy, to solve their own issues, and write off all the problems, internal problems, the consequences of their mistakes. The masses have launched a new plot of a criminal espionage drama in Russia.
драмы.
We are talking about the arson attacks in London from the 8th to the 12th of May this year of two properties and a car, which were previously used by Prime Minister Starmer. The case is being handled by the Counter-Terrorism Department of the London Police. 3 suspects were detained, 2 Ukrainians and 1 Romanian. Among the possible versions, personal hostility, terrorism, Islamic extremism, as well as the actions of a hostile state, are mentioned. At the same time, it was the last point, and only it was picked up by the majority of the British media, and made the headlines of the reports, literally as a factual confirmation of this story. Here, according to the Financial Times, law enforcement agencies are checking for direct quote, recruitment of arsonists by Russian special services, in the context of official London's obsession with the Russian threat, which, by the way, was confirmed by the Strategic Defence Review of Britain published by Starmer on June 2nd. Such attacks literally do not surprise any sane person. Obviously, there is a deliberate disregard for rational explanations, evidence of everything that is related to facts. In the incident with the property of the Prime Minister of Britain, the local media have already presented their audience, have already told everything, have written it into this anti-Russian performance. And on the 12th of May, the Criminal Court of England and Wales sentenced a group of Bulgarian citizens. They are accused of spying for Russia. On the 4th of June, the hearing on the arson case began. Are you thinking about this arson? No. In March of the 24th year, London warehouses with no Starling, intended for the Kiev defense regime. Also, allegedly, all this was organized on the instructions of the Russian special services. During his speech in Parliament, Starmer described the incident with the warehouses as a direct, quote, attack on all of us, on British values and democracy. I liked that he separated democracy from British values. It seems to me very self-revealing. One detail, however, completely deprives this media spectacle of intrigue. The fact is that the British authorities officially charged Russia with involvement in a criminal episode with warehouses just a month after the so-called arson at the end of April of the 24th year. Imagine, right away. These insinuations were then immediately distributed in honor of the central British media. At the same time, London, absolutely without waiting for the trial, the investigation, initiated a confrontation aimed at undermining the channels of dialogue between the countries. Remember, he was then expelled from Britain as a defense attaché. This is an unprecedented action for bilateral relations. Naturally, to all subsequent unfriendly steps on the basis of the principles of reciprocity, a proportionate response from the Russian country followed. However, the spirals of escalation, launched by the British a year ago, still affect the diplomatic missions of the two countries. Our embassy in London then stated that by demanding explanations from Moscow about the alleged connection of suspects with the Russian state, revealed by local security forces, the British side is deliberately anticipating the results of its own judicial procedures. But it also happened. It turns out that the British authorities, back in April of the 24th, more than a year ago, formulated everything, did everything, accused everyone, well, decided, made all the conclusions for themselves and for the public, formulated the composition of the crime, appointed the perpetrators, fixed the relevant decisions, even if not by the verdict of the jury, but by completely tangible actions, which had international political, legal dimensions of succession. I have one question. Why do we need a court now? But still, you decided then, a year ago, took all the so-called measures, appointed everyone guilty. Everyone publicly told everyone an explanation. Why do you need a court now? This simply undermines the latter's confidence in this most notorious British law enforcement judicial system. London has already invested in the anti-Russian version of the story with the arson of warehouses, prejudging the results of all subsequent court sessions. And all this despite the fact that the British authorities are so fond of ritually urging not to comment on certain processes in order to give the defendants the right to a fair trial. They pumped up the topic for a year, invented a story for a year, sent diplomats and so on, and we doubt that they will not let things take their course in the future, where there will be obvious and blatant inconsistencies in the case, such as accusations of defendants working for Russian intelligence services or something else. The authorities will do their best to convince the jury of their rightness, and, at the expense of their fantasies, the fantasies of experts, fabricated evidence, they will stretch a thread to the malicious influence of Moscow, the Kremlin's hand, the Kremlin's foot, and so on. Therefore, this is another story just so blatant that I just couldn't help but comment on it all. Well, for example, Northern Europe. Plans were announced to create, under the auspices of one of the largest Norwegian universities, the Arctic University of Norway in Tramset, a center for geopolitics, peace and security, which is designed, among other things, to study domestic political events in the border regions of Russia, as well as Russian policy in the Arctic, including interaction with BRICS and China. It is planned to connect to the new profile structure, the Master Institute, located in Kirkins, the focus of work research organization, which is also connected with Russia and the border region, being countries with neighbors and Arctic states in the region. Russia and Norway have always paid attention to research on the problems of the North. They have done bilateral interregional cooperation in this area. This is normal. There is nothing surprising in the fact that a competence center for Russia is being created on the basis of the Arctic University. Close cooperation with our country has been conducted by this institution since the early 90s and was one of the priority areas of its work. Among the partners of this university were dozens of Russian higher educational institutions, among others. As part of the academic mobility program, courses, internships, and student exchanges were held. Cooperation with the institution of the Russian Academy of Sciences has been actively developing, and currently all bilateral contacts are developing. And this is where an interesting story begins. In the field of science and education, including through the Arctic University, suspended through the Norwegian side, the academic scientific community of Norway has turned into a conductor of a confrontational attitude, dictated from the outside, and the majority of specialists profiled on Russian topics have retrained into ardent Russophobes, whose interest in the subject of Russia boils down to the desire to denigrate our country in every way. Everyone who expresses an alternative point of view, tries to find some answers to questions, is blocked, marginalized, ostracized. Therefore, the question arises here: what will the center created do if all real scientific contacts are blocked? We do not see the possibility that the center being created will live up to its name and really contribute to peace and security, as stated, or a more adequate objective perception of the geopolitical situation in Norway, mutual understanding of the international relations of our countries, and not their separation and the creation of new dividing lines. We would like to study, develop, interact, and would not break real scientific ties. Well, here's another hostile statement in the neighborhood too. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen did. Further, this is what I'm going to comment on this statement now, but of course, it is so knocked out even from the moan of Russophobia. It was all done on the 12th of June. She gave out a whole bunch of propaganda cliches that had filled her teeth, accused Russia, according to tradition, of all mortal sins. I will not list all of this, and aggression, and misinformation, and attacks on critical infrastructure. When missiles are flying towards civilian nuclear facilities now, we do not see such straightforwardness from such figures. They seem to pretend that they do not notice, do not see, turn away, find streamlined formulations. But then, when in general there are no reasons, well, except that the 12th of June is the day of Russia. But there are no real reasons to even cling to something. There is more than enough straightforwardness. Of course, she did not bother with any evidence of malicious machinations on our part, especially attempts to analyze what led to the current deep crisis of international security. There were just biased accusations without facts for us, and why I'm coming back to this now, why it's important to comment on it. For us, these biased accusations sounded really blasphemous, taking into account the venue of the event. In May of the 45th, it was the War of the Red Army that liberated the Danish island of Bornholm from the Nazi invaders. Judging by the foreign policy steps of Denmark and its allies, there is no doubt about the true culprits of the destabilization of the international situation. It is an indicator, for example, that just on the eve of the 11th of June, the Danish Parliament ratified the Agreement on Cooperation in the Field of Defense of the United States for the first time, granting the states the right to permanently deploy armed forces on Danish territory. The new treaty repeatedly increases the risks of deployment of nuclear weapons in the country, contrary to the obligations voluntarily accepted by the Danish side to prevent its non-proliferation on its territory. All this leads to a further increase in the very tension in the Baltic region and in the north of Europe, which the Prime Minister of this country is allegedly so concerned about in words. I would also like to remind you that Denmark has demonstrated an absolute lack of interest in conducting a full-fledged investigation of the terrorist attacks of the Nord Stream project on this project. She was absolutely not interested in establishing the true customers, the perpetrators of this crime, by providing massive assistance to the Ukrainian Nazis. Being one of the largest donors of weapons for the armed forces of Ukraine, Copenhagen provokes a further escalation of the conflict in Ukraine, actually in the center of Europe. The increase in the scale of casualties and destruction pushes Kiev to commit new war crimes against civilians. That is, it feeds a terrorist cell in the center of its own continent. This indisputably testifies to Denmark's unwillingness to contribute to the same global stability that the Prime Minister was so concerned about now. On the contrary, Copenhagen prefers megaphone accusatory rhetoric and the consolidation of new dividing lines on the European continent. But there is also good news. On June 14th, the Atomic Energy Agency of the Republic of Kazakhstan officially announced the selection of the State Atomic Energy Corporation Rosatom as the leader of an international consortium for the construction of the first nuclear power plant in the territory of this Central Asian state. The offer of our company was recognized as optimal, the most profitable. The Russian side expresses its gratitude to the Kazakh partners for their high assessment. We consider such an event as another evidence of the progressive development of strong allied relations between our countries, and we are ready to professionally fulfill our obligations under this strategic project, which is aimed at strengthening the energy security of our nearest neighbor. Specialists of the two countries are already conducting intensive negotiations on the technical and financial parameters of the construction of a nuclear power plant. A high degree of localization will be provided, and the training of qualified national personnel will also be provided. In fact, we are talking about the creation of a new full-fledged branch of the Kazakh industry, which will give a powerful impetus to the development of the economy of Kazakhstan. It is also worth noting that today Rosatom is the only company on the world market that, firstly, simultaneously builds 22 power units abroad, and secondly, has experience in integrating equipment from foreign suppliers into its projects. The Russian state corporation has the necessary competence to implement all stages of construction of nuclear power plants that meet modern technological requirements and the highest environmental and safety standards. But on June 16th, a groundbreaking ceremony was held at the construction site of a gold processing plant near the airport of the capital of Mali, Bamako. After commissioning, it will be managed by a joint venture with the participation of the government of the country and the Russian group of companies Yadrin. The capacity is up to 200 tons of precious metals per year. The project will be one of the first large industrial facilities implemented in the region by the Russian country. It will significantly increase the profitability of Mali's mining sector. In the future, the country can become an important center for gold processing, given that it is one of the three main producers of this precious metal in Africa. The event was attended by the president of the transitional period, Assimi Goït, who emphasized that cooperation with Russia is currently reaching a qualitatively new level, and thanks to the plant, Bamak will soon have the opportunity to purchase gold ore independently. Until now, let me remind you, the Republic has to export it for vintage to Switzerland or South Africa. Russia intends to continue taking systematic steps to increase mutually beneficial cooperation with Mali in the trade, economic and investment spheres, and to provide the necessary assistance in strengthening its industrial potential. On the 25th of June, the Republic of Mozambique celebrates the 50th anniversary of independence. On the same day, we also celebrate the half-century anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between our countries. We highly appreciate the relations of friendship and cooperation with Mozambique, which have a long history, dating back to the times of the national liberation struggle of the people of this country for independence. The race is a reliable, time-tested partner of Russia on the African continent. The bilateral political dialogue is developing dynamically. Cooperation in the international arena is being carried out at the highest levels, and ties in trade, economic, educational, cultural, and humanitarian fields are being awarded, and we congratulate our Maputo friends on such significant dates. We wish the people of Zabiga prosperity and every possible well-being, and to events that have already passed. On June 14th, the grand opening of the second Rachmaninoff International Competition of Pianists, Composers and Conductors took place in the Great Hall of the Moscow Conservatory. The ceremony was attended by the artistic director of the competition, People's Artist of the Russian Federation, Denis Matsuev, Honored Artist of the Russian Federation, Ildar Drazakov. The evening was accompanied by the Russian National Youth Symphony Orchestra. Valery Gergiev, People's Artist of the Russian Federation, chairman of the jury of the conducting competition, is at the conductor's desk. 65 musicians from Russia, China, neighboring countries, Azerbaijan, Belarus and Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, European countries of Britain, Germany, Spain, Italy, Romania, Slovenia, the Republic of Korea, the USA, Ecuador and Japan take part in the international competition. About the jury of the contest, outstanding cultural figures of Russia from 15 foreign countries. So to speak, greetings from the epicenter of isolation. Competitive auditions are held in Moscow until the 26th of June. The events are available for viewing and live. We invite everyone to view the bright performances of the contestants. The links will be in the text of the briefing. Well, everyone celebrated the 16th of June, both in our country and abroad. Artek International Children's Center celebrated its centennial anniversary. We take this opportunity, then and now, to join the huge number of congratulations coming from all over the world. For many thousands of Artek residents, as, for example, for my mother, this is a special date, a holiday and an occasion to remember the truly happy moments spent in our country on the Black Sea coast. And among our citizens then children, but not only children and adults. They were also counselors, mentors. In Artek itself, the anniversary was celebrated on a grand scale, of course, which we all saw. A whole series of festivals was held with the participation of numerous guests from abroad. Artek Children's Summit was held the day before, Dialogue for Peace and Development. More than 300 activists of children's organizations from 30 countries of the world took part in the event. You can read about everything on Artek's digital resources. We will definitely add a link to the briefing text. And there were also a lot of events highlighted on the resources of the Russian Foreign Ministry. Congratulations once again to Artek and Artek from all over the world, and also on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg Forum. There are events dedicated to this event. I am ready to answer your questions. Let's start from the audience. That's international life traditionally with us.
Hello, Maria Vladimirovna.
Hello.
This week, a deputy of the Seimas, Alexei Rozlikov, was detained in Latvia, who, I would say, spoke very emotionally during a meeting of the Latvian parliament in defense of the Russian language. However, he was later released on his own recognizance. But earlier, a case was opened against Rozlikov. He is suspected of assisting the Russian Federation and allegedly acting against Latvia and inciting national hatred. How would you comment on this situation?
A monstrous situation. I have already commented on it. I'm just going to remind those who may not know what we're talking about, although it seems to me that everyone already knows. This is another attempt by the punitive authorities of Latvia to bring to criminal responsibility MP Alexei Rozlikov. For what? Only because he openly advocated the preservation of the native language for a huge number of people, the Russian language. It is spoken by more than a third of the population of Latvia. This is a gross violation of all fundamental norms in the field of human rights protection, including, by the way, the provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. But it's just some kind of I don't know, as I do not know what, some term to pick up. This is some kind of racism to zero already. Do you understand? But it just didn't come to that. I really know a lot of manifestations of racism, Nazism, fascism. What just wasn't there? But, so that people are forbidden to speak their native language and literally make system programs for this and implement them forcibly. I don't remember that. This is a blatant case of persecution of the defender of civil language rights in urgent need of intervention in the relevant international structures. They have no right to remain silent, to turn away, to include, as they are called, strategic silence. If they value their reputation in any way, I'm not talking about conscience, but if they value their reputation, they also receive money from the member states of these organizations. For this, among other things, they are obliged to speak out. One more time, Russia strongly condemns the criminal prosecution of fabricated political cases of the Russian-speaking diaspora in the Baltic states, especially when it comes to repressions against compatriots who speak in defense of their native language. It is not something that is artificially incorporated. This is not a thousandth gender that is imposed on children. This is native speech. This is the native language spoken by generations of families who lived and worked there for the benefit of this country and this people. Is there more out there? Yeah.
The unrecognized Kosovo of the day called on us President Donald Trump to put pressure on Serbia to normalize relations with Turkey. That's how Russia does not evaluate such zealotry. What consequences can the intervention lead to?
Let me remind you that the so-called Republic of Kosovo, we take it in quotation marks, with its quasi-independence, is the brainchild of the West, the fruit of NATO's barbaric aggression of 99th year. And yes, indeed, the United States of America played a key role in this in everything. There were other administrations, there were other leaders, but the country seemed to be called the same way. And to this day, we see how the sponsors of this very Kosovo project, represented by Washington, Brussels, are seeking to legalize the separation of this native Serbian land from Serbia, condone Kurti in all his antics, turn a blind eye to the outright sabotage of their obligations by the Kosovars, first of all, most often the institutions of the Community of Serbian Municipalities of Kosovo. All of this has been fixed and confirmed, including at the international level. At the same time, they shamelessly put pressure on Belgrade, threaten, blackmail, but Belgrade has long shown its ability to negotiate and sincerity of intentions on this track. However, while respecting his principled position, the non-recognition of Kosovo's independence and not giving Pristina a place out, all this does not suit Western curators. They do not like it. It seems to me that it is useless to put pressure on Belgrade in this sense, because they probably don't really understand. They think that they will change Serbia's political approach to influencing the leadership, politicians in some way. They do not understand that for Serbia, this is not a political approach, but an existential issue. This is the essence, this is the cultural code, this is history. This is what shapes this people historically. Therefore, it is necessary not to try to put pressure on Belgrade, but to influence, if anyone needs to be influenced at all, then on the wards of the West, the Kosovars. The role of the international community in Kosovo affairs should be to assist Belgrade and Pristina in reaching mutually acceptable agreements. Here, of course, there is something to work on. This is how it is provided for in UN Security Council Resolution 1244, and this document is the legal basis for regulation, and it is necessary to rely on it. So, please, RIA Novosti, didn't finish something, did you? Yesterday, there are more questions. All right.
May I?
Christina.
Alcohol. I had to. Yes.
They say your microphone was broken. I can already. Yes, here, it's fine. She broke down, fixed it herself. Naturally, what movie is the phrase from? I'm going to remember now. Yes. They also remembered the movie. 2 questions, if I may. Maria Vladimirovna, the first question. I'm just vindictive. We know. So, the first question. How could you comment on the statement from Yerevan regarding the impossibility of simultaneous participation in the UN and the EU? But there's no denying the realism here. It's really quite difficult. Let's just sort it out in order. Armenia's potential accession to the European Union is indeed incompatible with the Republic's membership in the Eurasian Economic Union. It seems to me that this has been voiced repeatedly by the Russian side with a specific argument. It is obvious that the undeniable and real advantages that Eurasian integration brings to Yerevan. And what does Yerevan mean to the Armenian people? It is incomparable with the empty promises of Brussels, which are not backed up by anything. This is a fact, because there is a concrete benefit from Eurasian integration, so it is given both in figures and facts. And I think it is also well known who and how Brussels deceives. Moreover, at this stage, we are not even talking about the status of a candidate. The sample of the introduction may even stretch 4 decades. The big question is whether Armenia is expected in the European Union at all, whether it is not considered there exclusively as a convenient geopolitical tool at the current stage. After all, this is how the European Union played with a number of other states. As soon as the interest is lost, in case of a change in circumstances, any, even hypothetical responsibility for empty promises will also be removed. The exhausting long path of the so-called Europeanization, for example, of Moldova, Ukraine, what did it lead to? Nothing good. It led to the political and economic dependence of these states because independence was lost. Their own forces and resources were lost or wasted. And Yerevan, in case of rapprochement with the European Union, will lose the possibility of unhindered movement of goods and services in the common market of the EU. This is a fact. The customs duties will increase by a multiple, and there is a consequence of this. Accordingly, prices for Armenian consumers will increase, and the competitiveness of national products will decrease. Armenia will lose Eurasian advantages in terms of labor migration, technical regulation, sanitary, phytosanitary measures, and many other areas that belong to the supranational competence of the EU. So yes, that's right, it is. It just seems to me that it is necessary to tell in a little more detail why it is so that it would not be too late, and then the people of Armenia would not ask why they were not told all this. So that's it. And the second question is still, thank you very much. Again, I would like to ask you to comment on the 10th round of the EU-Ukraine human rights dialogue that took place in Kiev the other day. Thank you. This is an anecdote. It seems to me, imagine the EU-Ukraine dialogue on human rights. Where are these rights respected? By whom are they observed? They are all destroyed. They need to conduct a dialogue on the mockery of human rights. This will be the correct format. But in fact, They see it as a key element of the association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union, which clearly outlines Ukraine's obligations in the field of the rule of law, protection of human rights, fundamental freedoms including the rights of persons belonging to the so-called national minorities. And what do we have in reality? This format has transformed into an instrument of unconditional political support of the Kiev regime by the European Union. Over time, the discussion of the human rights situation in Ukraine began to occupy Brussels less and less, and the dialogue has long turned into another mechanism for coordinating the anti-Russian course. Well, tell me, if there was some kind of dialogue with the European Union on human rights, could the Kiev regime afford not to take the bodies of its own soldiers, referring to the fact that, yes, not referring to anything, but just not taking it away? Could this even happen? Where, in what state, would it be allowed to mock the human rights of both the person who died and the person who is waiting for him, and is looking for him or hopes to get at least a body? This time, European officials were concerned only about protection from discrimination. Who do you think? Injured, maimed, victims, their relatives, children? No. Sexual minorities are the main thing on the agenda of the EU-Ukraine dialogue on human rights. And, of course, the formal compliance of Ukrainian legislation in the field of religious freedom with Kiev's international obligations. Funny, it's not even a joke. This is already some kind of infernal joke. What freedom of religion, when we just said that they divide Christian priests into those who should be mobilized because their legal entity is called in one way, and those who will receive a reservation because the legal entity is called differently. And if one legal entity is replaced by another, then a clergyman will also receive a reservation. There were no complaints about the ever-increasing degradation of the human rights situation in Ukraine at all. Not a word about the brutality of the crimes of the Kiev regime against humanity, blatant disregard for international humanitarian law, discrimination against the rights of national minorities, persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Nothing. Once again, Brussels has turned a blind eye to the lawlessness against ethnic Russians, Russian-speaking citizens, committed within the framework of the state policy of forced Ukrainization and de-Russification. The infringement of the rights of other ethnic groups, including those directly within the competence of the European Union, has gone unnoticed. The growth of neo-Nazism, manifestations of racism, anti-Semitism, widespread restrictions on freedom of speech, repressive suppression of the opposition in general, of any dissent, has been totally ignored. It seems that earlier, all human rights in the West have always considered it not just possible, but necessary to mention freedom of speech as well. What is there with freedom of speech in Ukraine under Zelensky? And before him, by the way, too. After all, we regularly reflect the results of the so-called democratizing efforts of the Zelensky regime in the field of human rights and fundamental freedoms. In the human rights reports I have mentioned, it is better to talk about the lack of human rights in Ukraine. And since the 24th year, we have been making such reports together with Belarus. All documents are publicly available. We will definitely duplicate the links in the text of the briefing. Therefore, everything that makes up the classic sets of EU concerns in the human rights dialogue with any other third countries is left out of brackets. No hysteria, no meme photos with unhappy children or with disadvantaged people. Nothing, zero, everything is fine with them. Therefore, the next round of the so-called human rights dialogue of Ukraine Congress is a demonstration of double standards and hypocrisy, both in Brussels and the Kiev regime, and a vivid example of how much can be considered as objective assessments of the EU officials of the situation in third countries. The overwhelming hypocrisy, selectivity of the European Union in matters of interpretation and evaluation of humanitarian law norms is their calling card. Humanitarian law was not created by them. These are, so to speak, civilizational achievements, and they are interpreted exactly in the West as they please. And why? And in no small part, because they themselves have not observed all these norms for a long time, and they treat human rights simply as an instrument. But it wasn't just now, it was a long time ago. And the slave trade, and the Inquisition, the concentration camp, the genocides of entire nations, all kinds of discrimination. I'm sorry, 70 years ago, there were human so-called menageries in the capitals of the Old World, when children and people of a different skin color were shown to the inhabitants of Western Europe in cages and improvised. Here there is a zoo, and these are cello parks. It's true, this has documentary evidence and photographs. It's okay, the 20th century, by the way. So, if we go further, yes, please.
Hello, Maria Vladimirovna.
Hello.
Recently, Marco Free, director of an Italian TV channel, and that one precise blow to the Kremlin is enough for President Putin. At the same time, Rai works in Russia as an accredited foreigner, but has not yet commented on this word in any way. Do you have any comments?
Yes, always. It's just that in this case, my first desire was to double-check. Most likely this is some kind of error, or the account may have been hacked. But no, it all turned out to be true. Another thing is, the post was deleted after a few hours, because there began such criticism and such a struggle of people with this monstrous logic that apparently, I do not know whether it was a shame, or it became scary, or it was unpleasant, and this post was deleted. Nevertheless, we do not consider this incident to be exhausted, because it can also be qualified as a criminally punishable act, because it can really be qualified as public calls to carry out extremist activities, or public calls to carry out terrorist activities, public justification of terrorism, or propaganda of terrorism. But the fact that these extremist statements were made by a representative of the state television and radio broadcasting company of RAI testifies that the situation of free speech in Italy, well, it seems to me, has reached some really frightening stage. And some representatives of the mass media, and in fact, take it more broadly, of the establishment on eminence, simply lost touch with reality, ceased to understand and evaluate the consequences of their words and actions, and ceased to respect the law. You may or may not love someone, you may have different political views, but we all know and love this movie. The law is the law. And this phrase is not only from the movie, it is a phrase from life. Therefore, at least we expect an official apology from the management of the RAI broadcasting company. But it seems to me that Italian officials should also speak, who should say that it is not the norm for Italy to be so unbridled and so permissive. Just know what the problem is. The problem is whether it is not the government officials themselves, officials in Italy, who set such a tone of absolute irresponsibility. Here I will quote. I didn't believe it either, but it turned out to be the right quote. Look, yesterday or the day before yesterday, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni expressed the opinion that in Iran, according to her, there should be a change of power through the overthrow of the current leadership of the Iranian people. So she said that she always thought, always, by the way, when is this? That the best scenario would be the overthrow of the regime by the oppressed Iranian people, who would succeed. End quote. This is the basis on which the head of state of Italy speaks about regime change in another sovereign state.
Государство Италия говорит о смене режима в другом суверенном государстве.
Was she chosen by the Iranian people, or was she delegated, I don't know, by Iranian politicians or public figures of Iran, or Iranian deputies any powers, or does she have at least some relation to Iran, to its history and culture? On what basis does a person make such statements? I want to tell you more. It not only has no grounds, but it demonstrates absolute political and irresponsibility, and moreover illiteracy. Let me remind you that in fact, in 1965 year, the UN General Assembly, I hope Mrs. Melanie did not hear, adopted a resolution approving the Declaration on the Inadmissibility of Interference in the Internal Affairs of States, on the protection of their independence and sovereignty.
Недопустимости вмешательства во внутренние дела государств об ограждении их независимости и суверенитета.
This, of course, is not a binding resolution of the General Assembly, but it was adopted by an absolute majority of 109 votes with one abstention. Britain abstained for obvious reasons, which interferes with other people's bodies all the time. Is it really going to adopt some resolution condemning itself? But I wonder how Italy voted. I am sure that the Prime Minister of Italy has no idea about the existence of such a resolution, nor about how her own country voted. Italy supported, it voted for this declaration. If Italy has changed its position, then the Italian Prime Minister should formulate this approach and say that she no longer considers herself committed or bound by any obligations. But then the question arises, who authorized her to do this? We must still respect our predecessors, who, by the way, had a specialized education and served their country and their people, and created good, and created a product, and really created the ground for Italy's achievements. And just like that, to go through what was the official Italian position with such statements. To do this, you need to have some kind of authority, or just say that she is not aware that such documents have been approved by Italy before. And, by the way, I sincerely hope that this document, this declaration, will be read by everyone now, since we are talking about the fact that a number of Western countries are talking about absolute acceptability for them, and for almost everyone in general. Dictate to whom, where, which governments, how to overthrow, in what way, and in what time frame, that everyone will read this document. After all, this is a very detailed document. It is very large. It's not just a few paragraphs. This is an interpretation of interference in internal affairs. It is an explanation of the inadmissibility of any interference, including specific forms and examples. It should be understood that in 1965 year, this topic has already surfaced. It surfaced on various occasions, but it was reflected in such a full format document. And when I hear and see the reasoning of people, many of them have not shown themselves in any way at all. Well, in the form of concrete achievements on how to live for other peoples, who to elect, and even more so who to overthrow. I would like to say, you start small, you start by learning from the experiences of your predecessors. Start self-education. I'm sorry for taking so long, but this is probably part of the answer to the question of why journalists, in particular the state TV company, allow themselves such extremist statements. They hear what their leaders are saying. Thank you. Do you have any more? No, everything. Yes, please. Margarita Furlanka from Italy. I've been working for many years. I am the only Italian journalist who was represented at the BRICS Forum in Kazan in October. And I would like to present you with a book, my book, and I would like to ask you about the future of BRICS in terms of escalation, given the escalation in Iran. The future of BRICS, exactly, right. Escalation in the Middle East.
In the Middle East.
But it seems to me that if the world had not already demonstrated, the world majority had not already demonstrated the will to unite, and accordingly, the will to resist the imposed will of the minority, then there would be a huge number of such escalations, and they always ended tragically. Now the world community, the world majority, as I spoke about in detail today, is doing everything to work to de-escalate the situation. We see that the BRICS member countries are in the same way with Russia in different words, in different formats, but they act in the same way. Therefore, we should not talk about what the future of BRICS will be, but we need to see how BRICS is already responding to such challenges. So I have no doubt that the BRICS itself and other associations that reflect multipolarity will exist and develop. BRICS was also born earlier as RIC, then it became BRIC, then it became BRICS, now it has become BRICS. With a large number of countries, everything is alive, everything is developing. It will take different forms. It will make different decisions. It is a living, truly living, not ossified, not artificial, not dead structure, but a living structure. She has very lively goals and objectives. I have no doubt that she will, going through various tests, only strengthen her own positions. Why? Because her goals are noble. They are not destructive. They are not aggressive. So, let's move on. Please, just introduce yourself.
Maria Vladimirovna, thank you so much for the opportunity to ask a question. Victor Ternovsky, Spanish-Latin American edition of Sputnik. And our next question is, at this forum in St. Petersburg, we see a broad presence of the countries of the Global East, the Global South. In particular, there are many Latin American and Caribbean countries present here, which just concerns our editorial office. And the question is the following. How would you explain the interest of the region, the global majority of the countries of the Global South of Latin America, the Caribbean in particular, in business contacts with Russia? Thank you.
I think that in addition to everything else, in addition to traditional ties, in addition to traditional friendly contacts, they see opportunities that have opened up, not opening up, but opening up. They see fantastic potential, but the opportunities have opened up. The business of the European Union partially left. Someone remained who was able to defend their interests, and someone left. In particular, American companies are not allowed for many years from normal interaction with Russian partners. And look at the opportunities that have opened up. Therefore, they see commercial benefits, they see prospects, they see a resource base in providing these prospects. Why should they miss this benefit? There is still a moment. They are well aware that dependence only on cooperation with one center of power, pole, and so on may, so to speak, not provide the proper degree of stability. Moreover, they know what dependence is. They have gone through the processes of decolonization, and many of them, or the processes of occupation, or the processes of resistance to external intervention, and they understand what it means to be dependent. They do not want to be dependent. They want to be truly independent and build independent relations. One of the possibilities is to diversify ties by building cooperation with those countries that are friendly, that do not use these states, these regions as a tool, which develop real relations on an equal basis. I think we can talk a lot about this topic, but I would highlight it. So, please.
Maria Vladimirovna, Good afternoon. Yuri Lenov, the tape. Ru. We have one question. Vladimir Zelensky has repeatedly stated his intentions to discuss the purchase of a package of weapons for the armed forces of Ukraine. During a personal meeting with Donald Trump, initially, it was planned to discuss this during the G7 summit. And, in fact, how Moscow regards such statements in the context of the draft memorandum on the settlement of the conflict. Handed over to Kiev, in particular, the paragraph on the inadmissibility of arms supplies to Ukraine and the need to stop them.
And what? Zelensky is a rich man, can afford to discuss with Donald Trump the purchase, as you said, of a package of weapons for the armed forces of Ukraine. He buys with his own money, right?
Clarified.
He probably sold something, maybe a couple of forks of his own or his family. Maybe some organ has also mortgaged its own or can potentially sell it. I don't know what he has there great after such doses. But the statement, on the one hand, we are already used to the fact that he is there discussing purchases, and so on. And on the other hand, I would like to ask a question, but this is all a fortune acquired by excessive labor, due to corruption, due to uncleanness, fraud. Maybe he would have broken off some of this at least once, so to speak, for all these acquisitions of all these weapons and so on. Then, this statement is, of course, of a cosmic scale. And who will pay for it? Crippled Ukrainian people by their own regime, future generations who are already in debt, not having been born yet. Who will pay for all this? Those people who have lost the opportunity to live in a normal state, because the economy, industry, science, and education have been destroyed there. All this is put on the rails of some wild neo-Nazi ideology. And this is the way to nowhere, just nowhere. This may have some kind of instant effect, but we are well aware that nationalism leads to an absolute dead end. Therefore, I have the same question every time. For whose money does the bank bank so widely? After all, it's all issued on credit. This is all not gratuitous help. We know very well what Western support is. Here we paid for the Lend-Lease in full, but not so long ago, by the way. Do you understand? This is despite the fact that there were different estimates. We won't. We are always grateful for help and so on, but we know that it all cost money. And for that, everything was paid for. But this does not compare with those sums. And these are not even sums anymore. It's just a burden that, in the context of the future of Ukraine, was taken by the Kiev regime. These are not loans. These are not signed bills of exchange. This is the burden of the people. This is the first thing. Secondly, with regard to all his statements, you understand, I think that they should be considered not from the point of view of memoranda and so on, from the point of view of the main thing. These statements confirm that he does not need peace. He needs to retain power. He needs to prolong this very agony, no matter what, no matter what. He needs to continue pumping money for himself, for his entourage, for those who set him up, for all these concerns and so on, but not the world. The world will interfere with him in this. Absolutely not interested. Another proof is that these statements are proof that he is not interested in the fate of his own people. Well, we must repeat that this is all done at the behest, the coordination of British European sponsors. Therefore, I don't think there is any need to correlate this with memoranda and so on. Our position is principled. We focus exclusively on official channels, on substantive contacts. We agreed on what, as you can see, during the Istanbul agreements, we are clearly fulfilling ourselves, and we encourage them to fulfill their obligations. After the 22nd, the date will be formulated, and the date of the new round will be announced. It is on these contacts, within these contacts, that attention is focused, and not on Zelensky's hysterical statements, which are paid for, paid for by Westerners, are part of all these corrupt distillations of money. And can we take a couple of questions online with us? Here are the journalists as well. Is the Media Corporation of China with us? Yes, Maria Vladimirovna, good afternoon. We are with you. We have a question, so to speak. This year, Chinese-made cars are involved in the St. Petersburg International Ural, and in this regard, and in general, how would you assess the development of the Chinese automotive industry for the Russian market? You know, I can say that, of course, we all highly appreciate the successes of the Chinese automotive industry and Chinese automakers, and state that we also have joint projects with China. We see the success of Chinese manufacturers in the Russian market. But since you asked this question, although this is not my specialty, but I want to say, since I have been following the news and walking around the forum for the second day now, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that both the successes and achievements of the domestic automotive industry were presented at the forum. A large number of new models, a wide range of new products were presented. Well, it seems to me that several presentations have already taken place. This is AvtoVAZ. The main premiere is Lada Azimut, which was created by designers, engineers and technologies of AvtoVAZ in the recent history, in our country, for the first time. It aroused a lot of interest. I called the Lada Niva Travel SUV. I just drove by when we were approaching the press center. The Lada Aura business sedan also debuted. There are also racing variants of Lada Niva Sport 2, Lada Iskra, Lada Iskra Sport. The Russian company Solo, one of the enterprises located in Tatarstan, presented a compact van for CF business. One pickup truck was presented in the luxury class. New products from Mo were also presented. Here on the stand was shown a bulletproof crossover Commandant, an 8-seat premium minivan Oros Arsenal. Moreover, I am saying this now, I apologize if I may not be so precise, but about passenger cars of such a civilian purpose. And there are also agricultural machinery, military vehicles that but if you were on the forum, you would see. Therefore, you can also be happy for us, as we are happy for you. And let's say together, so to speak, let's say words of condolences to Westerners who have lost this market and lost the opportunity. And let's do it without any malice, but simply as a factual statement. And not only have they lost the sales market or the production market, but the most important thing is that they have lost. They have lost opportunities for joint scientific research, what they need right now. And what is co-production? This is certainly joint development, joint training, joint operation, and so on, joint testing. They lost all this because of their own, I don't know, stupidity, mistakes, stupidity. Please choose for yourself. So, is everything with you? Yes, thank you. Lee Reuter is with us. Let's take another question online. Is Reuter with us? Yes, I see it, but I don't hear it. I don't think there's any sound. Reuters. Now there is a sound. That's fine. Fine. Yes.
Good afternoon, Marina Vladimirovna. We are with you, and we have a question concerning Iran. We could tell you exactly what steps Russia is proposing to resolve the conflict over the Iranian nuclear program and bring the situation to a peaceful course. In addition to their proposals to host Iranian nuclear materials and act as an intermediary between the parties.
And not enough, right? As if you know it was all suggested. I want to say more, but what? Did many at least offer something? And what have Western countries proposed, for which the topic of the Iranian nuclear program is, well, if not the main one, then one of the first for many, many, many years? What did they suggest? Apart from regime change in Iran, what else have they proposed? But we know from the experience of other countries, and from the experience of experiments of Western countries, other states, they are not interested in a one-time regime change or the installation of some of their own modes. For them, this is an endless process. Both the election results and regime changes are non-stop. It's not one that they don't like the current regime in this or that state. This is because for them, it is the norm of perception of other countries. They do not allow themselves to think of other countries as sovereign at all. Therefore, in my opinion, what you have just listed, what actually exists, because you said it absolutely correctly, is already quite a lot in itself. To put it mildly, Moscow does not weaken its efforts aimed at escalating the Iran-Israel conflict. On the very first day of the hot phase, as I have already said, the President of the Russian Federation had telephone conversations with a number of colleagues. In their development, and in addition to them, the Minister of Foreign Affairs conducts these contacts with his colleagues. It is emphasized every time that Russia has fully supported and supports efforts to resolve the situation around the Iranian nuclear program peacefully, has put forward specific initiatives aimed at finding mutually acceptable agreements, and has expressed readiness to further contribute to de-escalation. The opportunity from the Russian side and the importance, perhaps even better to say the importance of returning to the negotiation process were emphasized, and the readiness to provide mediation efforts was expressed. Well, I will not list all the contacts that took place. I think you've heard. And we see the main task at this stage as consolidating international forces in the face of, well, a really rapidly growing nuclear catastrophe, which stubbornly pushes the world, those who started this adventure. And you know, I want to say, I have just said this repeatedly these days, it is striking that some literally minimized attention is paid, or better to say not paid at all, by the Western media to the topic of the nuclear threat. Look at how over the past 3 years in Russia, the presidents of our country, defense ministers, foreign ministers, representatives of the Security Council of the Russian Federation spoke about their commitment to nuclear security, the principles of nuclear security, the nuclear doctrine of our country, not departing from its key points, but our responsibility on this track. Immediately, all of this was taken out of context, and out of nothing, from literally a couple of phrases, plots, television, newspaper articles were made about what Russia allegedly threatens. It threatens nuclear weapons. It threatens nuclear security. For 3 years, we have been hearing a quasi-theme being exaggerated. There is no topic, but it is being exaggerated. And now, before the eyes of the whole world, direct missile strikes are being carried out literally live on objects that are connected with nuclear infrastructure of a peaceful nature. And it's as if everyone has forgotten Western mass media, Western political scientists, Western experts, such phrases as nuclear safety, the threat of not even proliferation, but the threat of radiation contamination in the event, and so on. The need for deconflicting in connection with the transition, the possibility of transition of the conflict phase into a completely new direction related to nuclear, atomic materials, and so on. None of this is there. They pay attention to the escalation, the shelling, who hit whom, how many victims. Attention is paid to many nuances, but the main thing seems to have dropped out of the international agenda of Western countries, as if there is no understanding. Perhaps this is an educational problem, of course, but we read and see a lot of things here. Maybe there is simply no real understanding of the degree of nuclear threat when we saw how missiles deviate from a given target, a given trajectory, even hit those who released them. What is the probability that some missile will fall into the wrong place or fall into the storage area of nuclear materials?
Что какая-нибудь ракета не туда попадет или попадет в зону хранения ядерных материалов.
I say again, not being an expert, but you understand what I'm talking about. And this cannot but worry any normal person who is familiar with banal ideas about physics, chemistry, and the corresponding reactions. I do not know, in our country, we have been warned from school about what radiation is, what nuclear weapons are, what nuclear technologies are, using the example of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where nuclear weapons were used by the Americans, using the example of, so to speak, catastrophes with peaceful nuclear facilities, the same Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Our children, students, and youth are brought up on this and really inspire, well, we can say righteous horror in the face of a nuclear catastrophe. And it seems that in the Western community, this topic is taken out only when it is profitable. When it's profitable, it's scary, and when it's not profitable, it's, well, in general, not so much to learn. To be honest, I look and think with horror every time. And here it is again. It flew from there to there or from there to here. And this now will not end with nuclear contamination of the entire region. And accordingly, the world. After all, it is also necessary to understand that the infection will not be local, and the radiation will not ask where it spreads, and whether its characteristics are sufficient to cross the border. You see, she'll go wherever she goes. There is a wind rose, the direction of movement of the water flow, and so on. That's what it will depend on, and not from, a political order from Brussels, Washington, London, or somewhere else. And here's the impression that it's as if the topic was taken and muted, turned on again. What was it called at the US? Strategic silence? To be honest, I am amazed where all the environmentalists are Western, where all the political scientists are Western, where all the activists, so to speak, where all the people who are engaged in nuclear security, who are there for disarmament forever under any circumstances. Where are they all? It's like they've all been turned off once. They are not given a platform to perform. They are not published. They are not taken to live broadcasts. As if this were not. You can imagine that if it were, for example, with some other country, and another country would fire at the country, targeting those objects that are related to nuclear energy. I only know one such country, the Kiev regime, Ukraine. It was she who fired at the Zaporozhye and cursed nuclear power plants. We called it deliberate shelling, which is on the verge of literally nuclear terrorism, because they knew where they were aiming. Do you understand? And again, the international community then, I mean the Western one, did not see anything. But here the situation is generally unprecedented. Do you understand? It just amazes me. The results of the emergency meeting of the UN Security Council on June 13th, the special session of the EIA Board of Governors on June 16th, after all, clearly demonstrated that the countries of the world majority strongly reject the confrontational course of the Israeli side, are not satisfied with the arguments with which Israel covers aggression against a sovereign state, demands an immediate cessation of strikes on Iran, including the nuclear energy infrastructure of this countries. And it's as if, all this is somehow carefully withdrawn from the Western media. Well, I think I've answered your question. So, yes, please. Yes, of course. I'm listening to you.
Maria Vladimirovna, good afternoon.
Hello.
The visit of Chinese President Xi Jinping to Astana has recently ended. As part of this visit, the Media Corporation of China signed a memorandum on the establishment of a media alliance for cooperation in the field of mass media. China, Central Asia. The purpose of forming the alliance is to create a single platform for cooperation between the media of Kazakhstan, China, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Dear Maria Vladimirovna, you are not only not necessary, but also a great expert on the global Asian agenda. How do you read how the creation of a media alliance between China and Central Asia affects the information agenda in the countries of the Global South? And does this mean that China is beginning to actively expand in Central Asia?
As you know, both Russia and China are interested in the prosperity of Central Asia. I'm telling you this sincerely, because Central Asia is an important geopolitical, trade, economic, and cultural center of Eurasia. We are closely coordinating with Beijing on regional issues. We are conducting fruitful cooperation with the countries of the Central Asian Five on joint platforms, each in its own format, on a bilateral basis. We consider such formats to be in demand, effective, meeting the fundamental interests of the peoples of our countries. I can't share your alarmist ratings of a running project. We have similar projects with Central Asian countries. We also conduct consultations. Our media enter into agreements with the media of these countries, both with China and with the media of Central Asia. It seems to me that the problem is different. The problem is that for decades countries have been fed only from one source, from the so-called Western mass media. Concluding agreements may be commercial, so to speak insignificant, namely implying single-track transmission of information, when even money was not required, if only the information of the Anglo-Saxon mass media of the country was taken. This applies to all continents. This is where alarmism has been going on for how many years? And the fact that other countries, developing their mass media and having their own content, and at the same time professing a peace-loving policy, a focus on cooperation, also want to cooperate and interact through the media. I don't see any alarmism in this and so on. For us, the Central Asian state, and for us, the Chinese are strategic partners with whom a regular trusting dialogue has been established on a wide range of issues, including interaction in the field of mass media, and we proceed from the fact that the work of the parties in this direction is designed to promote the dissemination of objective information about cooperation between our countries, including among foreign audiences. Yes, thank you. Yes, please. Good afternoon. Maria Vladimirovna, less than Earl greater than news. On the occasion of Russia Day, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan expressed confidence in strengthening relations with Moscow. The next day, Pashinyan made it clear that the government would like to keep Russian troops in the republic. Can we say that there is a positive dynamic in the relationship now? Thank you. As you know, we have a very wide range of cooperation with Armenia. We certainly have, as with any country, as between any countries, there are problematic issues. But to name or say that we are only planning, as you said, improvements or warming, but it's either accurate or impossible to formulate it that way. I would like to note once again that there certainly exists its own problems, its own dramaturgy, but I would not treat it like this, as you call it. If possible, here is the essence of the question, which particular quote you asked to comment on. I didn't ask for a comment on the quote, just. They talked about the application. No, Pashinyan stated that he expressed confidence in strengthening relations with Moscow and also made it clear that Russian troops will remain in the republic because this issue is constantly being raised one way or another. I don't know. We have a regular dialogue with Yerevan in all directions, along the lines of all departments that are, so to speak, determined to discuss this topic, and this issue has never been raised in a practical plane. Perhaps he was debated within, so to speak, communities or public or expert circles of Armenia. That's another question. But this issue has not been raised in our interaction with Yerevan. Thank you. So, yes, please.
Hello, Maria Vladimirovna. Business Code News Agency, Moscow. My question also concerns Armenia. In the light of recent events in Iran, it is obvious that the threat of the outbreak of hostilities from Azerbaijan, with Aliyev's long-cherished goal of seizing the Zangezur corridor, is looming in the region. I would like to know how Russia will react in this case and what will it do. Thank you.
You know, I really liked it. Well, it seems to me that this is just an exemplary response of the President of the Russian Federation. During yesterday's communication with the editors-in-chief, I will allow myself to plagiarize. I don't even want to think about it. I don't even want to discuss it, to be honest. I don't want to. Our efforts are aimed at stabilizing, well, at least now de-escalating the situation in the region, of everything related to Iran, with Israel's aggressive actions against Iran. We are conducting relevant work with Yerevan and Azerbaijan on normalization in this area, in this region. We have mechanisms, appropriate working groups, and specialists at the appropriate level to solve all these issues. So I really don't want to. Well, I say again, not my phrase, not my find. I don't even want to think about it. I don't even want to discuss it. Well, how can I say? The management said so. So it's possible to use this formula like this. Really, honestly, both Azerbaijan and Armenia are dear to us as countries and peoples with whom we have been developing relations for centuries, with whom we have such close ties. For us, Iran is a country with which we are developing relations, not so much plans. This region, which has experienced so much, if we take it in a broad sense, yes. And now our actions and policies are focused on, this is one of the priorities, by the way, to bring stability there, consolidate it economically, show the advantages and priority of progressive development and interaction, rather than conflict potential. Of course, it's not for me to tell you how many forces, intersections, and knots are tied there. I think you can guess and know. But you asked the opposition of Russia, and I introduced it to you.
Thank you very much.
So, yes, please.
Hello. Vladislav Stylmov, Peter-24. There will be a question about sports. How has international sport been rebuilt without the participation of the Russian Federation, and how, after all? So that the politicization of sports does not prevent Russian athletes from adequately representing our country in the international arena.
Thank you. You know, without Russian athletes, world sport has become orphaned. Without the achievements of Russian athletes, world sport has become impoverished. And over the past decades, as a whole, it has been subject to so many different destructive influences that, unfortunately, again, we can say that it has also degraded. Now everyone is discussing how to overcome that monstrous, I don't know, suicidal engine or mechanism that has been screwed, including into the Olympic movement, by introducing this very gender agenda, by creating some new forms, not forms, but perverted forms of competitions. Yes, you've seen it all, and the last Olympic Games have shown what it all leads to. Therefore, it seems to me that it is necessary to confess to officials from the World Olympic movement and from world sports, which many are already doing, someone retiring and allowing themselves to be more outspoken or even outspoken. Someone finding the courage and representing this or that federation in sports, this or that sport. They are already saying that this is the way to nowhere, and the blow may be inflicted on Russia, but they fall again on the general, universal world movement. And in general, common sense forces should now be concentrated on analyzing how to get out of this situation. There can be no world sport, let alone the Olympic movement, based on the principle of segregation of athletes based on nationality, political conjuncture, double standards, or the destruction of rules in favor of political orders. It can't be. It won't be a sport even then. It will be something completely different. Show, business, politics, anything but sports. Sport is about something else. Sport is about the physical capabilities of the body, about the combination of science and the efforts of athletes, about educational processes, about competitiveness, about fortitude, about, well, by the way, about the combination with other spheres of life and areas of science, technology, economics, and so on. That's what modern sport is about, and not about going back to the times of some kind of Neolithic, when someone hit someone on the head with some kind of club, who tripped someone up, who kicked someone with some kind of stone. He is stronger. Sport is about something else. This is not about strength, and about achievements, and about the combination of the possibilities of science, and about the strength of the spirit, and not only about physical strength, and about the accumulation of civilizational experience, in the piggy bank of which there are so many wonderful achievements, and not even dehumanization on sports grounds. So, yes, please. Thank you very much, Yulia Shapovalova. Maria Vladimirovna, we have just quoted you in our live broadcasts, when you spoke about the inadmissibility of Israeli strikes on Iranian facilities, Iranian ones, Naya Klea, A nuclear facility, yes. And a colleague from Reuters also asked you about what Russia can also do for Iran within the framework, or maybe within the framework of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement between our countries. Here is an additional one. A colleague asked about another one from Reuters. He said, in general, what can Russia do except that, yes, in general, within and outside the framework, so to speak.
All right.
Such a small additional question. And what could Russia do to ensure that? If Russia has some levers of pressure on Israel, what could Russia do? Perhaps some sanctions or something else to help resolve this conflict. Well, I would still be in question. You asked it, you have the right to do so. But it seems to me that we still need to talk not about pressure, but about opportunities, beliefs, proposals. This is our vocabulary. We are making contacts. You know very well about telephone conversations. Well, these are negotiations that took place over the phone, including with the Israeli leadership. Well, they take place behind closed doors, but there is a detailed description of them. The negotiation process on Iran's peaceful nuclear program should be continued and can be continued. The Russian leadership has repeatedly spoken about this at all levels. We have experience, the world has experience. The second point is to hear and understand what Iran really wants. Not to think for him, not to invent for him, but to hear and understand what this state and its people want. To develop a peaceful nuclear program under the supervision of existing international institutions, such as the IAEA, hosting staff and experts of this structure, reporting accordingly, participating in all the necessary formats that such cooperation implies. Solve existing issues in a mutually respectful manner. This is what we are calling for. This is what we are motivating for. And we are using our capabilities on this, on these negotiation tracks. Well, more than the President said yesterday, answering several similar questions. It seems to me to say, difficult. But please pay attention to his interview yesterday by a foreign media outlet. Interview, conversation. I think he presented it all exhaustively. Yes, thank you. Because you see, this is what we talked about today. This negotiation process was underway. It had prospects. There were already concrete plans for further tracks. And all this was disrupted by this unprovoked aggression. Therefore, now we need to do everything to restore. Although it is clear that it is difficult, but we see it that way. Yes, please. Hello, Anna Komliuk, Hooray Point Ru. How and when is the evacuation of cancer patients from Israel planned? Is there something specific you want to ask? Yes. When in the first place, it is planned to take out patients at all, because all of them. Yes, everyone. Well, I'm sorry, please. Please forgive me. But still, if you undertake to ask a question on such a sensitive topic, and you understand that you are on the air, but you need to prepare somehow, probably. Excuse me, do you understand how many people now, having such diseases, or having relatives with such diseases, flinched there just from your question? In general, you are aware that it is necessary to comply professionally if you undertake to cover such topics. I will be happy to answer your question if you ask me specifically with knowledge of the facts and understanding what you are asking. I will allow myself to help you out of this ridiculous situation by clarifying whether you are referring to the story of a particular family that the media wrote about.
конкретной семьей, о которой писали средства массовой
The girl
информации
was
в
being
личном
treated.
подробном
If you are talking about this particular situation, then it is under the personal control of our ambassador to Israel, and Russian diplomats are dealing with it. The family has relevant information in this regard, and all this has been done for several days. If you are talking about something else, about some other cases, specify. We will definitely respond. Thank you. Let's take a few questions, please. We have Verilk online.
Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. I have 3 questions today. The first question, of course, I can't help but ask about the situation with the arrest of Samvel Karapetyan, a well-known Russian-Armenian businessman. He was arrested for 2 months. The process has begun. The process of nationalization of his property in Armenia has been announced by the authorities. How do they relate to this in Russia, and to the fact that often the justification for his criminal prosecution in Armenia by the pro-government media is that allegedly this person is presented to Russia and actions against him are justified in this way?
No, actions. Now let's take any other situation. This other one, with another person. Actions cannot be justified when it comes to criminal prosecution. They cannot be justified by nationality. Whether it's citizenship or, I don't know, nationality, actions can be justified. If we are talking about criminal prosecution, by facts, data indicating a violation of the law, you'll forgive me, but still we have to operate with you with something, well, somehow intelligible. I don't even want to reflect on the huge flow of statements that have been made in this regard. We said that a Russian citizen who has Russian citizenship, a Russian entrepreneur, like any other Russian citizen, and a Russian entrepreneur always receives help and support if he turns to our embassy to the Russian side. Whether he, his lawyer, or his relatives, you know perfectly well that these statements have already been made in order to further discuss this topic. I absolutely agree with you. We need to understand what exactly is happening there in the form of clear statements, accusations, or something else. Because so many statements have been made, so specific, that let's first figure out what exactly is being discussed. Once again, as a Russian citizen and a Russian businessman, of course, he will be provided with the necessary assistance.
Thank you. The second question. You have partially answered it, regarding the Zangezur corridor. But, Maria Vladimirovna, at the end of May, Russian Defense Minister Belousov described the situation around the Sinitsa region as tense. In the same days, US Secretary of State Mark Rubel, speaking in Congress, also said that there is a possibility of escalation. In this regard, I would like to know how Russia now characterizes the situation around the Syunik region, taking into account the events that are taking place in neighboring Iran.
And you know that the process of unblocking transport communications between the Caucasus, and we have repeatedly stressed, should go exclusively by peaceful means. The surest way to lift the transport blockade in the region is to resume cooperation as soon as possible, within the framework of a trilateral working group co-chaired by the Deputy Prime Ministers of Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The last meeting of the group in Moscow took place in June of the 23rd year. The parties were close to a solution on most practical issues. So this is if about this question. Did you have any other aspect or not? Any question?
No. And here is a question about the evacuation of Russian citizens from Iran. When there was information on the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, only the checkpoint on the border with Azerbaijan was noted as an opportunity to evacuate from Iran. And in this regard, questions arose as to why the Armenian visitor from Armenia is not specified. Moreover, there are no quarantine restrictions. Are there any political or technical reasons why the checkpoint was indicated on the Foreign Ministry's website only through Azerbaijan?
There are no political reasons. There were no grounds there that had any factual data not to use this path either. In other words, there was no politics or any obstacles. It's just that he wasn't involved in this channel or this transition before. But at the same time, a transition was involved, as we have said, through the territory of Azerbaijan to the territory of Azerbaijan, which was used, given that there was already experience. As soon as the first sharpness passed, they began to use the passage through the territory of Armenia, as I said today. And, accordingly, the information will appear, and she has already appeared this morning. I checked, talked to colleagues. She has already appeared. Therefore, I thank you for such a very caring attitude, because we know that historically there would never have been such a thing that Armenian friends and colleagues would have refused the opportunity to use the passage when it is needed for humanitarian purposes. There was no doubt that everything would work out. It's just that logically at that time, there was more experience working with that particular passage, and now the possibilities of passage through the Armenian side are already involved, for which we are also grateful to our Armenian friends and colleagues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is the author and with us?
Yes, hello, Maria Vladimirovna. Good afternoon. Ruslan Vadratov, the author, and we have one question for you today. Quite recently, thanks to your personal participation, of course, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, some kind of introductory question was resolved: how are payments to the military?
No. Oh, I really am. No, I am. I had nothing to do with it. That's for sure, I can tell you. But it's not me. I am only commenting on this question.
Okay, well.
I can say that Russia, as you know, faithfully and fully fulfills its obligations under the bilateral agreement with Latvia on cooperation in the field of social security from 2007 year, and the blame for the emergence of an artificial, I emphasize, created crisis, with a delay in the first half of the 25th year of financing pension payments, which rely on compatriots living in Latvia, lies entirely with the Western community of its financial institutions, which pay lip service to socially unprotected groups, but in fact only engage, apparently, in sexual minorities. People who need money because they earned it with honest work, and they do not receive it, but they need this money. As you know, these are not some huge volumes. This is a pension. This is what many people live and count on. It's up to these groups that the Western right man does not care. They actually blocked transfers from the authorized bank of the Russian Federation because it fell under illegal sanctions. Russia is making active efforts to resolve the situation. The work is carried out through the Ministry of Labor and the Social Fund of Russia.
Can we roughly assume when this issue will be resolved?
I'll clarify. I'll ask my colleagues how we are. Yes, and we will return it. And back to you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, there are more questions with us in the hall. Do we have any more? Here we have the voice of the fatherland. Yes, from the questions. Is the voice of the fatherland with us? Okay, good. Who maybe I haven't named yet. Someone on our online communication wants to ask a question. Colleagues.
Yes.
Timirovna. Yes, here it is possible. Addition. News. Fine, yes. Let's start with buts first. Ladies, thank you very much. As is known, the Latvian, Estonian, and Russian media in Ukraine are from such a side that Russia is highlighted as the aggressor and Ukraine is the victim. At the same time, almost no word is mentioned about the crimes committed by the Kiev regime. Vladimirovna, what should be the release of the response to hostile situations on Russia, and is it possible? Well, I understand your question correctly as follows. Why do the Baltic countries one-sidedly highlight and support only the Kiev regime with information? Do I understand this question correctly? Because it was hard to hear. Yes, yes, it means because they have such a role. You understand, you can advise something not so much to do. I can honestly say that I would advise not so much to increase informing our own public in an objective way, exclusively on the situation around Ukraine, as to deal with the pressing problems of our own countries. Science can be developed, technology can be moved, and a huge number of social issues can be solved in some way. In general, think about how and in which direction they are developing. But they have such a role, they have been given such a small niche, such, they have fenced off a backwater where they cannot even swim, but just stand in knee-deep water. Their function within the European Union and NATO is to be aggressive and endlessly express this aggression into the microphone. This is their main task. For the sake of this, or under dictation, they destroyed everything that connected them in a pragmatic way with Russian business, with Russian culture, with Russian science. Everything that gave concrete results for their own citizens, which fueled and developed these countries. They systematically destroyed it all. Well, I do not know. Of course there is something left, but if we talk on a large scale, then of course they inflicted a colossal blow on themselves. They would like to restore all this somehow, not even with us, but just try to do, I do not know, create their own educational clusters, areas of development and application of scientific achievements. Find some use for yourself, in this world, just to understand who are they here in the world economy. There is a distribution of responsibilities. Every country does something, gives something. Manufacturing, energy, I don't know, education, science, sports, culture. What do these countries give? They have to identify themselves in some way in terms of their role in the world. I'm not talking about people now. I'm talking about regimes. It is impossible to see your own internal foreign policy reduced only to aggressive, and often the stupidest statements, of a Russophobic nature. That's what I would advise them. So, let's do it. Thank you. To the final question. The young man is in touch with us.
Hello, Maria Vladimirovna.
Hello?
Less than Earl, greater than addition.
Yes.
We would like to ask you a question. We have one question. Will the Foreign Ministry comment on the statement of US President Donald Trump, who called Russia's exclusion from the G8 a mistake? He said this on the eve of another G7 summit. According to Trump, the initiators of the erroneous decision were the then leaders of the United States and Canada, Barack Obama, and Justin Trudeau, and Russia's membership in the G8 could have prevented the Ukrainian conflict, the American leader noted.
It seems to me that again it is possible. You have a few questions. The first thing, probably, is that this is not the only mistake of the West. The 7 or their NATO-centric countries are not the only mistake. In particular, the same Donald Trump spoke about the losses that Western countries have suffered from non-cooperation, or from conducting an anti-Russian sanctions policy and a trade war against our country, at the same 7 now in Canada. This is the first thing, and in general, it would be nice to inventorize all these mistakes by themselves, not for us, for themselves. The second point, is that you also need to speak as it is. We were members of the G8, but we weren't fully members of the G8. Again, only a political cluster was defined for us then. Here, we could be present in the political segment, but in the economic segment, and the 8 or 7 were more involved in the economy, we could not be present. The next moment, At some stage, it was clear that this design has outlived itself, and there is evidence of this. First of all, it did not include the leading economies, which have already really shown themselves that way. Secondly, after the crisis of 2008 year, caused again by the fall, collapse of the American real estate market, this soap bubble, which entailed monstrous consequences for the entire world economy, stock exchanges, and so on, finance. The 8 or 7, well, at least the economic 7, could not offer anything to the world to correct, again, their own mistakes. For this purpose, the 20 was created. That is, sorry, a 7 shat, and they asked a 20 to get out. But it's true, because the G20 arose not just as the influence of time or the need of a historical moment, but because it was necessary to save the world economy from the consequences of speculative actions of the American real estate market, which is such, the collapse of which entailed such consequences. This was another proof that you can call yourself leading, great, exceptional, the most important bosses of all bosses, as much as you want, but in fact, you do not have the opportunity to implement even what you are obliged to do. So that's how I would comment. Initially, to be honest, we were not going to comment on that either. But in response to your question, I would pay attention to this. Therefore, Russia has made its choice, a choice in favor of real mechanisms of global manifestation. This is the BRICS, this is the SCO, this is the 20. They represent the leading centers of economic growth and political influence in the emerging multipolar world. 7 or whatever they want to group there. There's 6 plus 1, 1 plus 6, 8 minus 1. I do not know. We are not interested. It has outlived itself. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm saying goodbye to everyone. Have a good stay at the forum in St. Petersburg, and for foreign guests also in Russia. Thank you.